The room went completely still. Not the polite silence of a formal dinner, not the respectful quiet when someone important walks in. This was the kind of silence that happens when 300 people simultaneously forget how to breathe, when something so unexpected, so raw, so achingly human unfolds in front of them that the entire nervous system just stops. A little girl who hadn't spoken a single word in nearly 7 years had just broken free from her mother's hand, sprinted across a marble ballroom floor in her tiny patent leather shoes, and thrown her arms around a man she had never met in her life. And then she whispered 4 words. 4 words that would change everything. "Will you stay, please?" Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you stories that will stop you in your tracks. Stories about love, survival, family, and the moments that remind us what it means to be human. Drop a comment below and tell me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to that ballroom and find out what really happened that night. The Hargrove Grand Hotel had seen a lot of charity events over the years. Chicago's wealthiest families had stood in that same ballroom drinking overpriced champagne, bidding on auction items they didn't need, and making tax-deductible donations that looked generous on paper. The room was built for spectacle. 30-foot ceilings, crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's houses, marble floors so polished you could see your reflection staring back up at you like a warning. Ava Sterling had attended this particular fundraiser 3 years running. She didn't particularly enjoy it, but the Westbrook Children's Academy had been Mason's school before it became Sophie's school, and Ava had learned a long time ago that showing up mattered, even when you didn't feel like showing up. Especially then. She stood near the far end of the room in a deep navy dress that her assistant had picked out, holding a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched, listening to a man in his 60s explain his opinion on something she'd stopped tracking about 4 minutes ago. She nodded at the right moments, smiled when it seemed expected. Her eyes were doing what they always did at crowded events, finding Sophie. Her daughter stood about 12 feet away, positioned exactly where Ava had placed her, close enough to a marble column that her back was never fully exposed, near enough to the side corridor that a fast exit was always possible. Sophie wore a white dress with small yellow flowers along the hem. Her dark hair was braided back. She stood completely still, the way she always did in rooms full of strangers, with her arms drawn slightly in toward her chest, and her eyes tracking the room in that slow, deliberate way that made Ava's heart hurt every single time she saw it. Sophie was 8 years old, and she hadn't spoken a word, not one, in 6 years and 8 months. Not since the night 2 men in ski masks had broken into their home, snatched her from her bedroom while Ava was downstairs, and driven 3 blocks before a passing patrol car cut them off. The whole thing lasted less than 11 minutes. Sophie was physically unharmed. But whatever had lived inside her voice before that night, it had gone somewhere Ava couldn't reach. Doctors called it selective mutism triggered by acute trauma. Therapists called it a protective shutdown. One specialist had referred to it as the psyche building walls faster than love can climb them, which sounded poetic until you were the mother sitting across from your silent child at breakfast every morning, watching her eat her cereal in absolute quiet and wondering if she would ever say your name again. Ava had she'd stopped counting at $2.4 million. Different specialists, different treatment programs, different approaches. A sensory integration center in Denver. A trauma-focused residential program in Vermont that Sophie lasted 6 days in before Ava pulled her out because the child had stopped sleeping entirely. Art therapy, equine therapy, music therapy. A woman in Boston who claimed she could reach nonverbal children through rhythmic breathing exercises, which had done absolutely nothing except cost $11,000 and 3 flights. Nothing had worked, not even close. Sophie wasn't getting worse. The therapists were careful to remind Ava of that, always very careful, always very gentle in their framing. She's stable, Ms. Sterling. She's present. She's engaged in her own way. We're not losing ground. But they weren't gaining any either. And tonight, like every other public night, Sophie stood in her little yellow flower dress and watched the room with those careful, ancient eyes. And Ava watched her from 12 feet away and tried not to let the grief show on her face. The man arrived late, That was the first thing Ava noticed about him, though she wouldn't have been able to explain later why she noticed it at all. Crowded charity events ran on their own loose schedule. People drifted in and out. It shouldn't have registered, but he came through the side entrance, the one most guests didn't know about, and he moved through the room differently than everyone else. Not with the particular self-consciousness of someone trying not to be noticed, and not with the deliberate confidence of someone who wanted to be. He just moved. Clean lines, efficient, like a person who had spent a long time in situations where unnecessary motion was a liability. He was holding a small boy by the hand. The boy was maybe 6, with a round face and a gap-toothed grin, and the kind of unself-conscious energy that belongs exclusively to children who have never once in their lives worried about whether they were likable. He was wearing a clip-on tie that was already slightly crooked and appeared to be explaining something to his father at high volume, using both hands for emphasis. The man listened to all of it, actually listened, not the half-present nodding of a distracted parent, but genuinely tuned in, leaning down slightly to catch the words, responding with what looked like a real answer. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the particular way that doesn't come from a gym, the kind of build that comes from actual physical work done over many years. Dark hair, a little longer than corporate standards, a suit that fit but looked like something he'd put on reluctantly, like it was borrowed from a version of himself he only occasionally needed to be. He could have been 35, could have been 40. His face made it hard to tell. There were lines around his eyes that shouldn't have been there yet, and a steadiness in his expression that had the particular quality of something earned rather than assumed. He found a spot near the back corner, close to the wall, and stood there with his son, scanning the silent auction tables. Not scanning the room, not checking who was important, just looking at the items on the table with mild, unhurried interest. Ava didn't think much about him beyond that first observation. She went back to nodding at the man in his 60s. Sophie moved first. That was what made it impossible. Ava had looked away for maybe 40 seconds. Someone had asked her a direct question about the Foundation's quarterly numbers, and she'd actually had to focus. And when she looked back, Sophie wasn't at the marble column. The cold spike of fear was instantaneous and total. 300 people in the room, and Ava's eyes swept across all of them in under 2 seconds, the same way they always did. The way they had been doing since the night those men took her daughter, the way she suspected they would never fully stop doing for the rest of her life. She found Sophie in 4 seconds. Her daughter was walking, not being led, not pulled, not following anyone. Walking on her own, with clear direction and obvious intention, straight across the marble ballroom floor toward the back corner, toward the man with the clip-on tie son. "Excuse me," Ava said, and she was moving before the sentence was fully out of her mouth. Sophie crossed the last few feet at a near run, and then she did something Ava had never, in 6 years and 8 months of doctors and therapists and treatments, seen her do with any stranger. She wrapped her arms around the man's waist and pressed her face against his side. The man looked down. He didn't startle, didn't pull back, didn't do the thing most adults did when a strange child unexpectedly touched them. That slightly panicked stiffening, the automatic search for the responsible parent, the nervous laugh. He just looked down at the small girl attached to his side with the calm attention of someone who understood that sudden, unexpected things sometimes required stillness rather than reaction. The little boy, his son, looked up at Sophie with round eyes and said, loud enough for Ava to hear from 15 feet away, "Hi, are you lost?" Sophie turned her face up toward the man, and in a voice so quiet that the 3 people standing nearest had to lean in, and in a voice that Ava had not heard in 6 years and 8 months, her daughter said 4 words. "Will you stay, please?" The man held perfectly still. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition. The particular expression of someone who has seen something before, in a different form, in a different place, and is now watching it surface again in a context they weren't prepared for. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." Ava arrived at her daughter's side 2 seconds later, heart slamming. "Sophie?" She stopped, looked at her daughter, still holding onto this stranger's jacket, then looked up at the man. "I'm so sorry. She isn't usually—" The words came out tangled. She tried again. "I don't know what happened. She doesn't do this." It's all right, he said, simply, like it actually was. She doesn't speak, Ava said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word, which she hated. She hasn't. There are reasons. I'm sorry. I'll get her. She can stay, the man said. She wants to. Sophie's grip on his jacket tightened. The man looked down at her again. You want to stay for a bit? Sophie didn't answer with words, but she gave the smallest, most certain nod Ava had ever seen from her. Okay then, he said. He didn't make it a big moment. He didn't look around to see who was watching, didn't adopt the expression of someone doing a generous thing. He just shifted slightly so that Sophie wasn't pressed quite so awkwardly against him, reached over to the silent auction table, and picked up a brochure, turning it over in his hands like nothing unusual had happened at all. His son tugged his sleeve. Dad, she didn't answer me. She heard you, though. How do you know? Because she looked at you when you asked. He glanced at Ava briefly. He talks a lot. Fair warning. Ava stared at him. I'm Ava. Ava Sterling. Cole Walker. He didn't extend his hand. Both were occupied, one with the brochure and one at his side near Sophie. That's Mason. I'm 6, Mason said immediately, apparently considering this essential information. He's very serious about that, Cole said. On. Ava didn't know what to do. In practical terms, she understood that she should take Sophie's hand, apologize again, and go find their assigned table on the other side of the room. She had people to speak with, board members, a foundation executive who was flying back to New York at 10 and needed 20 minutes with her beforehand. Her schedule for the evening existed for a reason. Sophie's hand found Cole's. Not Ava's. Cole's. She just reached out, without looking, the way children reach for the hand of someone they trust when they're walking on uneven ground, and wrapped her small fingers around his. Cole looked down at the joined hands, then back up. You have a table? He asked Ava. We do. Ava hesitated. You? Back section. Mason picked it because it has the best view of the dessert table, apparently. I did extensive research, Mason confirmed. Sophie made a sound. Ava went perfectly still. It wasn't a word. It was barely even a sound. A tiny exhale of something. A breath shaped almost like a laugh, aimed at Mason's statement about dessert research. But it was more than Ava had heard from her daughter in years. Ava had to look away for a moment. She studied the middle distance and breathed carefully through her nose, and did not allow herself to cry, because she had learned that when she cried in Sophie's presence, Sophie's face went immediately to that locked, guarded expression that broke Ava's heart all over again every time she saw it. Can we sit with them? She asked, and hated how her voice sounded, too exposed, too willing. She was 30 years old. She ran a company with 1,600 employees. She had sat across negotiating tables from men who had spent decades trying to intimidate people and smiled pleasantly while she took them apart piece by piece. She was asking a mechanic in a borrowed suit if she could sit at his table because her daughter was holding his hand. Fine by me, Cole said. Oh. They stayed for 2 hours. Ava's foundation executive did not get his 20 minutes. She texted an apology and a promise to call him in the morning and put her phone face down on the table. Mason talked for most of those 2 hours. He had opinions on everything. The food, the chandeliers, the fact that the silent auction had a painting that looked, according to him, like someone sneezed on a canvas and decided it was art. He explained to anyone who would listen that his dad could fix any engine made before the year 2010, that his favorite food was waffles with the crispy edges specifically, and that he was planning to be either an astronaut or a professional taster of waffles, depending on how the opportunities shake out. Cole mostly listened, occasionally corrected small factual errors. Once, when Mason described his father's truck as basically a rocket ship on wheels, Cole said, Mason, it has 180,000 miles on it, and the passenger window sticks. It sticks at a very cool angle, Mason said. That's generous. Sophie sat beside Cole and did not speak, but she watched Mason the way Ava had never seen her watch another child, with something that looked almost like hunger, like someone pressing their face against a warm window. She accepted a small bowl of fruit that Cole pushed gently toward her without comment. When Mason laid crayons and a folded paper menu on the table between them, producing them from his jacket pocket with the air of someone who always came prepared, she took the red crayon and held it. She didn't draw anything for a long time. Then, slowly, carefully, she drew a bird. Mason looked at it and said, "That's really good. Mine always look like potatoes." Sophie looked at the potato bird Mason was drawing on his side of the menu, and the corner of her mouth moved. Ava saw it. She didn't say anything. She picked up her water glass and drank from it, and stared at a point somewhere above the chandelier, and breathed. Cole didn't ask Ava about the company. He didn't mention having recognized her name, though she suspected he had. Most people did, and then spent the rest of the evening making it slightly awkward. He didn't produce a business card or make a pitch or angle the conversation toward anything he might want from her. He asked, once, how long Sophie had been at Westbrook Academy. "This is her second year," Ava said. "She's in Miss Ellison's class." "Mason had Miss Ellison last year. She's good. Sophie likes her, or I think she does. It's hard sometimes to—" She stopped. "It's hard to know what she's thinking." Cole nodded. "No follow-up, no advice. No, have you tried this specialist, or I read something about that?" Just the nod. Ava looked at him sideways. "You're not going to ask?" "Ask what?" "What happened to her? Why she doesn't talk? People usually ask." "Not my business," he said simply. She studied him. Most people don't respect that boundary without needing to be told. "Well?" He moved Mason's water glass slightly away from the edge of the table, a small, automatic parental adjustment, the kind you stop noticing you're doing after a while. "I've spent time around kids who went quiet for reasons they didn't choose. Asking why never helped any of them." Ava went still. "What kind of time?" He didn't answer right away. He watched Mason attempting to draw what appeared to be a waffle. Then he said, "I was in the military for a while. Some of the work involved—" He paused. "Kids in bad situations. You learn to read what they need from you, and what they don't." Ava looked at Sophie. Sophie had taken the blue crayon now. She was drawing something next to the bird. It took Ava a moment to recognize it. A house. Small. With a square window and a door and a thin line of smoke from a chimney, the way children always drew houses. Not how houses actually looked, but how they wanted them to look. Contained. Warm. Safe inside. Ava set her water glass down very carefully, because she realized, sitting at a dessert-adjacent table in the back section of a marble ballroom, that her daughter, her silent, careful, walled-off daughter, had just done something she hadn't done in front of anyone in 6 years. She had told a stranger something, not in words, but in the only language she'd been using since the night the world proved it wasn't safe. Cole looked at the drawing too. He didn't comment on it. He didn't draw any conclusions out loud, or reach for significance, or say anything meaningful about it at all. He just picked up a crayon, the yellow one, and set it next to Sophie's hand without a word. She looked at it. Then she picked it up and added a sun above the house. Across the table, completely unaware of any of it, Mason held up his drawing triumphantly. "I think this waffle looks very realistic." "It looks like a raft," Cole said. "A realistic raft." And Sophie's mouth moved again. The same thing as before, that almost shape of a smile. But this time it lasted a half-second longer. Neither Ava nor Cole knew that somewhere in the back of the ballroom, half concealed by a column identical to the one Sophie had spent the evening positioned near, a man in a catering uniform was watching the table. Not the room. Not the event. The table. He stayed for 11 minutes. Then he adjusted his collar, turned, and walked through the service entrance. The night ended without incident, but someone had begun keeping count again. Ava didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark of her bedroom on the 41st floor of the Sterling Tower residences, staring at the ceiling with her hands flat on her stomach, listening to the quiet hum of the city below, and running the evening backward through her mind the way she always ran problems, methodically, from every angle, looking for the things she'd missed. Sophie was asleep down the hall. Ava had checked 3 times. Her daughter slept the way she always slept in the aftermath of difficult evenings, curled on her side with her knees pulled up, one hand tucked under her cheek, her breathing so careful and controlled that even unconscious she seemed to be managing herself. Ava had stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the rise and fall of Sophie's shoulders, and thought about 4 words spoken in a voice she barely recognized anymore. "Will you stay? Please?" She kept turning it over, the specific phrasing of it. Not who are you or don't leave or even just please on its own, but will you stay? Like Sophie had looked at a man she had never encountered in her life and immediately, instinctively understood that he was someone who might leave, someone who perhaps made a habit of leaving or who had left before, or who carried the kind of presence that felt temporary, and decided that temporary wasn't acceptable. Not this time. Not when something in her 8-year-old chest had suddenly and inexplicably recognized something in him. Ava had a doctorate in behavioral economics. She'd built a company from a $70,000 line of credit into a platform worth more than $1.5 billion by understanding, at a very fundamental level, how people made decisions and why. She could read a room the way most people read a newspaper. She could not explain what had happened in that ballroom. She pulled her phone off the nightstand. 2:17 a.m. She opened a browser and typed, Cole Walker, Chicago, then stopped, closed the browser, put the phone back down. It felt wrong, like checking someone's pockets when their back was turned. She lay in the dark a while longer. Then she picked the phone back up and typed it anyway. There wasn't much. A business listing for Walker Automotive on North Kimball Avenue. An independent repair shop. Reviews mostly positive. One person complaining about a 2-week wait time for a transmission job. 4 people calling Cole specifically by name and saying he was the only mechanic they'd trust with their car. A Facebook page for the shop with photos of engines and the occasional picture of Mason sitting on a shop stool eating a sandwich with grease-stained hands, grinning like someone who found the whole situation extremely satisfying. No LinkedIn, no news mentions, no professional profile of any kind. She searched his name with Navy attached and got nothing specific. No records, no citations, no unit histories with his name in them. Which, she knew enough to understand, meant either he'd never served at all or he'd served in the kind of capacity that didn't generate public records. He had said, I was in the military for a while, the way people said things they were deliberately underplaying. Ava had met enough people in her life to recognize understatement as its own kind of language. She put the phone down again at 3:04 a.m., and this time she actually tried to sleep. It took another hour. When she finally went under, she dreamed about a marble floor and a little girl running across it, and the sound of small shoes on polished stone, and 4 words repeated over and over in a voice that still sounded, after all these years, like something she was terrified of losing again. Sophie woke up asking for her sketchbook. Not in words. She came downstairs in her pajamas, stood in the kitchen doorway, and pointed at the cabinet above the refrigerator where Ava kept the art supplies, then mimed the act of drawing with such clear precision that Ava had the sketchbook in her hands before the coffee finished brewing. Sophie took it to the kitchen table and opened it to a fresh page. Ava poured her coffee and leaned against the counter and watched sideways, trying not to make it obvious that she was watching. Sophie knew when she was being observed too carefully. It made her slow down, close in on herself slightly, like a plant that pulls back when you touch it. The drawing took about 20 minutes. When Sophie finally pushed back from the table, Ava crossed the kitchen and looked. It was the table from last night. She recognized it immediately. The round shape of it, the cluster of people sitting around it. Sophie had drawn herself and Mason on one side, their heads bent over what was clearly the folded paper menu with crayons. She'd drawn Ava across from them, her posture captured with uncomfortable accuracy. The slight forward lean, the hands folded on the table. The careful expression Ava wore in public that she privately thought of as her managing face. And she'd drawn Cole at the head of the table. He was the only figure in the drawing whose posture was fully open, shoulders back, weight settled, not leaning in any direction. Sophie had given him a slight tilt of the head, like he was listening. His hands in the drawing were at rest, not gripping anything. It was a child's drawing. Proportions loose, perspective approximate, details simplified. But Ava looked at the figure of Cole Walker and recognized, in the particular way that you recognize something true, even when you can't fully explain why, that Sophie had drawn him the way she saw him, not the way she'd been told to see someone, not the way you drew a stranger at a dinner table, the way you drew someone who already made sense to you. Ava set her coffee mug down. Can I keep this? Sophie considered her for a moment. Then she closed the sketchbook and held it against her chest and went back upstairs. Which meant no. Obviously no. But Ava had looked long enough to memorize it. She called Dr. Patricia Okafor at 8:30. Dr. Okafor had been Sophie's primary therapist for 3 years. She was the one Ava trusted most, not because she'd produced the most results, which she hadn't, but because she was the only one who had never once made Ava feel like Sophie's silence was a problem to be solved on a schedule. She'd sat in rooms with Sophie for 50 minutes at a time, twice a week, for 3 years, doing art and puzzles, and occasionally just sitting in comfortable quiet, and she had never once come out of a session with the defeated expression that Ava had learned to dread on therapists' faces. She reached for him, Ava said. She was standing at the window of her home office, watching a delivery truck make its way down the street below. She initiated contact, physical contact, with a stranger she'd never met. A pause on the line. How did he respond? He didn't pull back. He didn't make a big deal of it. He just let her stay. And her effect? She almost smiled. Twice she made a sound. Not a word, but a sound. Like the beginning of a laugh. She drew with his son for an hour. Ava stopped, pressed the side of her fist lightly against the window glass. She spoke, Patricia, 4 words. The silence on Dr. Okafor's end was the particular silence of someone absorbing information very carefully. Tell me exactly what she said, Ava told her. Another pause, longer this time. You said she'd never met him before. Never. I've never seen him before either. He has a son in Sophie's school, apparently, but they'd never crossed paths that I know of. And there was nothing about him specifically, nothing you can identify, that might have seemed familiar to her. A resemblance to someone, a scent, a voice register. Nothing I could see. Ava turned away from the window. But she knew him, Patricia. I don't know how else to describe it. The way she walked to him. It wasn't random. It wasn't a lost child grabbing the nearest adult. She crossed a room full of adults and chose him specifically. She walked past security guards and waitstaff and board members and went to a mechanic in the back corner. Dr. Okafor was quiet for a moment. Can you bring her in Thursday instead of Friday this week? Yes. And Ava. A brief pause. Don't push. Whatever happened last night, let it breathe. If you try to examine it too closely with Sophie, you may shut it down. Ava already knew this. She'd known it for years. The hardest thing she'd learned since Sophie's trauma was that the instinct to do something, to move quickly, to push the moment, to try to reproduce the conditions that had worked, was almost always the exact wrong impulse. I know, she said. I mean it. Let it breathe. I know. She hung up and stood very still in the middle of her office for a moment. Then she opened her laptop and pulled up the Walker Automotive Facebook page again. The most recent post was 3 days old. A photo of a rebuilt carburetor with the caption, 1968 Chevy truck, back from the dead. Owner cried. Not going to specify who else did. 7 people had liked it. 3 had left comments, all of them some variation of only Walker gets it right. There was a phone number in the business listing. She wrote it down. Then she closed the laptop and went to get ready for work and told herself she wasn't going to call it. She called it at noon. 3 rings. Then a voice she recognized, lower on the phone than it had been in person, a little rougher around the edges, like someone who'd been working since early morning. Walker Automotive. This is Ava Sterling, from last night. A brief pause. Not the pause of someone who didn't remember. The pause of someone recalibrating slightly. Ms. Sterling, I wanted to... She stopped, started over. I wanted to say thank you for last night, for letting her sit with you. She didn't need my permission, he said. Still. Ava turned her chair slightly away from her desk, facing the wall. I also wanted to ask if you'd noticed anything about Sophie. I know that's a strange question from someone you met once, but you said last night that you'd worked with kids in difficult situations, and the way you were with her was different from how most people approach her. So I'm asking if you noticed anything. A longer pause this time. She could hear something in the background. A wrench being set down, maybe. The small sounds of a working shop. I noticed some things, he said finally. Can you tell me? Another pause. Not hesitant, exactly. More considered. The pause of someone who is choosing their words with care rather than choosing whether to speak at all. In person would be better. This isn't a phone conversation. Ava's hand tightened slightly on her own phone. All right. When? I close the shop at 6. I pick Mason up at 3:30, so any time after that he'd be with me, which might be... That's fine. Ava said. And then, because it was true. Sophie does better when Mason's around anyway, from what I saw. She heard something on his end that might have been a short exhale. Not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. Yeah, he has that effect on people. It's mostly involuntary on his part. The park on Maplewood, by the school. There's a bench on the east side near the maple trees. Do you know it? I know it. 6:30? 6:30, he said. Then, bring your sketchbook. Ava blinked. Why? Because it's how she talks, he said simply. And I'd like to understand what she's been saying. The line went quiet for a moment, and then he said, I'll see you at 6:30, and hung up before she could respond to what was, possibly, the most perceptive thing anyone had said to her about her daughter in 6 years. The park bench on the east side of Maplewood Park was slightly damp from an afternoon shower, and somebody had left a bicycle tire wedged in the roots of the nearest maple tree, as though they'd been meaning to come back for it, and simply hadn't. Ava arrived 7 minutes early and sat on the dry end of the bench and watched two pigeons engage in what appeared to be a territorial dispute over a pretzel fragment. Sophie sat beside her with the sketchbook in her lap. She'd agreed to bring it with a small expression of suspicion that told Ava she knew something was being planned, but she'd come anyway, which was its own kind of trust. Cole arrived with Mason at 6:28. Mason was eating something from a paper bag, crackers possibly, or some kind of chip, and immediately announced upon spotting Sophie that he had brought enough for everyone, which was generous in intention, if not entirely accurate in fact. Cole sat on the far end of the bench, leaving Mason to colonize the middle portion with his paper bag and his opinions. He was in his work clothes still, dark jeans, a faded green Henley with a small grease stain on the left forearm that he'd clearly scrubbed at without full success. He looked more like himself, Ava thought, than he had in the suit, like a person who occupied their actual life comfortably rather than fitting into borrowed versions of it. Thanks for coming, she said. Sure. He nodded at Sophie. Hi. Sophie looked at him, then she opened her sketchbook to the drawing she'd done that morning, the one from the ballroom, and held it out toward him without preamble. Cole took it, looked at it for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. You drew this morning? Sophie nodded. It's good. He turned it slightly in his hand, studying it. Then he passed it back. You've got everybody right. Mason leaned over to look. Hey, that's me. Dad, she drew me. Why do I look like that? Like what? Like I'm very serious about the crayons. Because you were, Cole said. Sophie almost smiled. Ava filed it away. Cole sat back against the bench and looked at the maple trees for a moment. Then he said to Ava, Can I ask you something first? Yes? The kidnapping attempt. She was alone when it happened, or she was in her bedroom, Ava said. The words came out level and practiced, the way you said things you'd had to say many times to many different professionals. I was on the ground floor. I didn't hear anything until they were already in the car. A patrol car intercepted them 3 blocks away. The whole thing was under 12 minutes. She wasn't physically hurt. How long after did the silence start? 4 days. Ava looked at the pretzel fragment the pigeons had finally divided. She was talking fine in the hospital, talking to the officers, talking to me, and then on the 4th day she just stopped, like something had been running on reserve and finally ran out. Cole nodded slowly. And since then? Any moments? Any partial? Last night, Ava said. Last night is the only time. He was quiet for a moment. Mason, apparently sensing that the adult conversation had moved into territory that required him to be marginally less loud, had shifted his attention entirely to Sophie and was currently showing her something on his palm, a small, smooth stone he'd apparently found interesting enough to carry in his pocket for the day. Cole watched his son for a moment. Then he said, It's not that she can't talk. I know. I know what the therapists say. I'm saying something slightly different. He turned to look at her directly. She talks when she believes it matters enough to risk it. Last night she decided it mattered. Ava held his gaze. What made it matter? I don't know exactly. He looked honest saying it, not evasive, not falsely modest, actually uncertain. But I can tell you what I saw. She was scanning the room all night. Exit points. Anyone who moved too fast, too close. She had herself positioned near the column so nobody could come up behind her. She was managing the space. She always does that. I know. But she was doing it at a level that most people wouldn't catch. Most adults look at a quiet kid at a party and think the kid's shy. What Sophie was doing wasn't shyness. He paused. It was surveillance. The word landed harder than Ava expected. She'd known it in some form, but hearing it said plainly, without softening, by someone who clearly understood the difference between a child being introverted and a child conducting a constant threat assessment, it sat differently. You recognized it, she said. Yeah. He said it simply, without drama. I've seen it before. Kids who came out of hostage situations, or who witnessed things they couldn't process, or who'd had their sense of safety taken away in one moment when they'd had every reason to believe they were safe. He glanced at Mason, who was now teaching Sophie some kind of complicated handshake that involved 3 separate steps and appeared to require intense concentration. The silence isn't the problem. The silence is the symptom. What's underneath it is the part that matters. She still believes the world can take something from her without warning, and until that changes, speech isn't going to feel safe. Not because she can't form the words, but because words mean revealing yourself. And revealing yourself means giving someone the ability to use that against you. Ava felt something in her chest shift and tighten. 6 years of therapy, she said quietly. That's essentially what they keep telling me, in different language. Yeah. He didn't say, so why are you surprised? Or they're right then, he just acknowledged it. The part I can't answer is why she reached for me specifically, that I genuinely don't know. Does it matter? He thought about that, turned the question over. Maybe not. Maybe what matters is that she did. Mason had successfully taught Sophie all 3 steps of the handshake. He was now performing it with enormous pride, looping her hand through the sequence and watching her follow with the attentiveness of a student who was taking this extremely seriously. Sophie's face was not open exactly, not the way most children's faces were open, that unguarded flow of expression. But there was something present in it that Ava recognized as the closest thing to ease her daughter ever showed. What did you do? Ava asked. In the military, specifically. Cole looked at her sideways. Why? Because you said you worked with kids in bad situations. And the way you described what you saw in Sophie last night, that's not something you pick up in a weekend seminar on childhood trauma. He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just deliberate. The same quality she'd noticed at the ballroom, that sense of a person who only said things after he'd decided they were worth saying. I was a SEAL, he said. 12 years. The last 4 were primarily in personnel recovery, which sometimes meant recovering civilians, including children, from situations where speed and calm were more important than almost anything else. He paused. You learn to read effect fast in those contexts, because a kid who shuts down on you in the field is a kid you can't move quickly, and not moving quickly gets people killed. So you get good at recognizing the specific quality of a shutdown versus a managed survival state. They look similar from outside. They're very different to work with. And Sophie? Managed survival state. He said it without hesitation. She's not shut down. She's operating. She made a decision last night that cost her something. Saying those 4 words cost her something real. And she made it anyway. That's not a kid who's lost herself. That's a kid who's been running a very long, very exhausting protection protocol. He glanced at Sophie again. She's tired, and she's waiting. For what? He picked up a small maple seed that had landed on the bench beside him and turned it over between his fingers. For evidence that it's over. Ava sat with that for a moment. The weight of it. The specific cruelty of it, that her daughter had been conducting this internal vigil for nearly 7 years, waiting for something to prove that the world wasn't going to take her by surprise again, and that every new specialist and every new treatment program had been, from Sophie's internal perspective, simply more strangers in a long line of strangers asking her to trust them. How do you give someone that evidence? Ava asked. Logically? Rationally? How do you prove to a child that safety is real? Cole was quiet for a moment. You don't prove it, he said. You can't prove a negative. You just stay. You show up consistently. You don't make promises you can't keep. You don't push for things before they're ready. You let them test the edges of it on their own time. He set the maple seed back down on the bench. It's slow, it's not dramatic, and there's no moment where it locks in all at once. It just accumulates. How long? He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was honest to the point of being uncomfortable. However long it takes. That was not a satisfying answer. Ava was aware that she wanted a satisfying answer. A timeline, a protocol, a defined set of steps. She had built her professional life on defined steps. She was very good at timelines. You make it sound simple, she said, and she heard the slight edge in her own voice and didn't entirely try to smooth it out. No, he said, I really don't. A beat of silence. Sorry, she said. Don't be. He wasn't offended. He just looked at her with the same steady attention he'd given Sophie the night before, like he was simply waiting for whatever came next. You've been running at this problem for 6 years. That's a lot to carry. It was such a plain thing to say. Not I can't imagine or you've been so strong or any of the adjacent phrases that people offered when they wanted to acknowledge difficulty without getting close enough to actually feel it. Just, that's a lot to carry. Like carrying weight. Weight was a thing he understood from direct experience and didn't need to dress up. Ava looked at her hands. Yeah, she said. It is. Across the bench, Mason had apparently taught Sophie 3 more variations of the original handshake and was out proposing that they put them in a sequence and perform the complete version for Cole, which Cole greeted with appropriate enthusiasm. Sophie positioned her hands and ran through the sequence, carefully, precisely, the way she did everything. And when they reached the final step and Mason declared it officially perfect, she looked up at Cole. He gave her a thumbs up, simple, not effusive. Sophie's expression did something small and real and completely unguarded for approximately 1.5 seconds before she pulled it back. But 1.5 seconds was more than Ava had had in years. They walked back toward the parking area when the lights started going orange and the temperature began to drop. Mason had found a stick somewhere and was using it to conduct an imaginary orchestra, which he explained was necessary because someone needed to keep the birds in the trees on rhythm. Cole let this proceed without comment. Sophie walked between Ava and the edge of the path, maintaining her usual buffer of personal space on all sides. But when they reached the corner where the park path split toward the parking area, she stopped. Cole stopped too, looking at her. Sophie looked back at him. Then she looked at the direction they'd come from, then back at him, then at the cars. Like she was trying to communicate something through the logistics of the moment. We're parked this way, Cole said, gesturing toward the lot. Sophie's eyes tracked that direction. Then she looked at him again, and the expression on her face was something Ava had spent years trying to catalog and couldn't quite name, part question, part confirmation, part something that lived below language entirely. I'll be around, Cole said. He said it the way you said things that you meant to be true and intended to make true. Not as reassurance, as information. Mason's at Westbrook. You're at Westbrook. We're around. Sophie looked at him for another moment. Then she reached out and touched, very briefly, the back of his hand. 2 fingers. Just for a second. And then she turned and walked toward the car, and Ava followed, and Mason called out a goodbye that contained at least 4 separate components, and Cole stood at the fork in the path with his hands in his pockets and watched them go. Ava didn't look back until she reached the car. When she did, he was still there. She didn't know why that made her feel something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Something that wasn't relief exactly, and wasn't hope in the way she usually understood hope, with all its attendant fear of disappointment. It was something quieter than that, more durable. She got in the car. Sophie had the sketchbook open in her lap already. She drew on the drive home with the calm focus of someone who had been given something to work with. Ava didn't try to see what it was. But that night, after Sophie was asleep, she found the sketchbook left open on the kitchen table. The drawing was the park. The bench, the maple trees, the orange light in the approximate direction of where the sun had been going down. 4 figures on the bench, and in the corner of the page, the bicycle tire still wedged in the tree roots, drawn with such precise detail that Ava stood in the quiet kitchen for a long moment before she understood. Sophie had been paying attention to everything. She always had been. She just hadn't been able to tell anyone what she saw. Not yet. But the bicycle tire in the corner of the drawing, rendered with careful, deliberate strokes by a child who noticed what other people walked past without seeing, that small, stubborn detail said something Ava couldn't fully translate and didn't need to. Something was shifting, slowly, imperceptibly. the way ice begins to move in early spring before anyone has decided to call it a thaw. Something was shifting, and somewhere across the city, in a small apartment above a repair shop on North Kimball Avenue, a man who had made a quiet promise to a silent child was almost certainly not thinking about it at all, which was, Ava was beginning to understand precisely why it was working. The weeks that followed the park bench had a quality that Ava didn't have good language for. Not progress, exactly. Progress implied a measurable forward line, and what was happening with Sophie didn't move in a line. It moved the way water moves through limestone, invisible and patient, and reshaping things so gradually that you only understood what had changed when you looked back at where you'd started and realized the landscape was different. Cole had meant what he said about being around. It started small. Mason and Sophie were in different grades at Westbrook Academy, but the school ran a shared afternoon activity period on Tuesdays and Thursdays, where older and younger students were paired for various projects: reading, building things, organized chaos that the administration called creative collaboration, and the children called free time with supervision. Sophie had always spent those periods alone at a corner table with her sketchbook, and the teachers had learned not to push. But on the first Thursday after the park, Mason Walker appeared at her corner table, dropped into the seat across from her with his paper bag of crackers and his absolute lack of self-consciousness, and said, "I'm supposed to be building a birdhouse with Tyler, but Tyler glued his fingers together, so now I'm free. Can I draw with you?" Sophie looked at him for a moment. Then she pushed the crayon box to the center of the table. The teacher, Mrs. Chandra, mentioned it to Ava at pickup that afternoon with the careful, measured tone of someone who understood that this was significant without quite knowing how significant to call it. "Sophie allowed another student to join her today," she said, "at her corner table. She hasn't done that before." "I know," Ava said. She picked Sophie up, and they drove home, and she didn't ask about Mason, and she didn't ask about the table, and she ordered Thai food for dinner because it was Sophie's favorite, and she let the afternoon sit in the room between them without poking at it. Sophie drew at the kitchen table while they waited for the food. When Ava set her plate in front of her, Sophie looked up and held the sketchbook out, showing the current drawing without speaking. 2 figures at a table, crayons in the center. Ava looked at it. "Looks like a good afternoon," she said. Sophie pulled the sketchbook back and went back to her pad Thai. It was not a conversation, but it was the closest thing to one they'd had in years. Cole texted on Friday. Ava's phone had shown an unknown number until she added it to her contacts the night of the phone call, and she'd labeled it simply Walker, the way you labeled a contact when you weren't sure yet what category they belonged in. The text said, "Mason says Sophie let him sit with her Thursday. Wanted to let you know, in case it hadn't been mentioned." Ava stared at it for a moment. Then she typed back, "It was mentioned. Thank you for the nudge, even if it was a 6-year-old doing the nudging." A pause. Then, "He volunteered. I just didn't tell him not to." She didn't respond to that immediately. She sat with it for a few minutes. The particular quality of a person who understood that doing nothing was sometimes the most precise form of action. Then she typed, "How's the truck?" Another pause, longer this time. Then, "Still not a rocket ship. Window still sticks." She found herself smiling at her phone like a person who had forgotten she knew how to do that. She put the phone face down on the desk and went back to the quarterly report she'd been ignoring for the better part of an hour. Over the following 2 weeks, Cole brought Mason to Maplewood Park on Saturdays. He didn't invite Ava. He mentioned it once, in passing, in a text that said, "We do the park Saturday mornings if Sophie ever wants company. No pressure. Mason brings crackers." The first Saturday, Ava took Sophie somewhere else entirely, mostly because she didn't want to seem like someone who was engineering circumstances. The second Saturday, Sophie stood at the kitchen window at 9:15 in the morning in her pajamas and looked at the street outside with an expression that Ava had learned, over 8 years of close observation, meant she was waiting to make a decision. "Do you want to go to the park?" Ava asked. Sophie didn't turn from the window. "Mason's usually there Saturday mornings," Ava said, careful to keep her voice level, like she was relaying a weather report. "With his dad." Sophie turned then, looked at her. Something passed across her face. Not quite suspicion, not quite hope. The particular expression of a person weighing risk against possibility. She went upstairs and came back down 10 minutes later dressed and carrying her sketchbook. Ava drove them to Maplewood Park. She told herself she was doing this for Sophie. She believed that almost completely. Cole was on the bench with a coffee and a paper cup, watching Mason attempt to climb a maple tree with a level of ambition that consistently outpaced his upper body strength. He looked up when they came around the path corner and did the thing that Ava had already started to notice was specific to him. He didn't perform surprise or enthusiasm or any of the social display emotions that people usually reached for in these moments. He just nodded, like their arriving was a reasonable thing that required no special acknowledgement. "He's been at that tree for 20 minutes, he said, by way of greeting. "He's making progress," Ava said. "He really isn't." Sophie had already moved past the bench to the base of the maple tree, where she stood watching Mason's efforts with the evaluative expression of someone assessing structural failure. Mason looked down from his current altitude of approximately 4 feet off the ground and said, "I'm going to get to that branch," pointing to a branch that was, conservatively, 8 feet up. Sophie looked at the branch, looked at Mason. Then she looked at the specific series of knots and protrusions in the bark that formed a rough ladder up the trunk, pointed at them in sequence, and mimed the footwork. Mason stared. "Oh," he said. "Oh, that's... yeah, okay." He repositioned his foot on the first knot. "Like this?" Sophie pointed at his other foot. He adjusted. Got 2 feet higher. "She's teaching him to climb the tree," Cole said. "She used to climb everything," Ava said. She hadn't meant to say it. It came out before she'd decided to let it. Before. She was fearless. She used to climb the bookshelf in her room like it was a ladder. And I'd come in and find her sitting on the top shelf reading, about 7 feet up, completely unbothered. Cole was quiet for a moment. "What happened to that kid?" "I don't know," Ava said. "I keep hoping she's still in there." He looked at Sophie, who was now directing Mason's ascent with pointed gestures and small, deliberate movements of her hands. A whole language of indication that the two of them had apparently worked out in a very short time. "She is," he said. It wasn't a platitude. He said it the way he said most things, like a statement of observed fact. Ava found that she believed him in a way she hadn't been able to believe the professionals who had said essentially the same thing in better words, and she spent the drive home turning over why that was. She thought it might be because Cole said things he appeared to have direct evidence for. He hadn't known Sophie before the trauma. I was not operating from hope or from the emotional investment of someone who needed her to be okay. He was reading what was in front of him, the way he'd described reading children in field conditions, quickly, accurately, without the interference of what he wanted to see. He saw what was there. And what he saw, apparently, was a kid who was still in there. Ava gripped the steering wheel. Sophie was in the passenger seat with her sketchbook, drawing without looking up. The radio was off. The traffic was light. It was a Saturday morning in October, and the maples had gone full orange, and the city looked like a postcard of itself. And none of that mattered as much as the fact that her daughter had just spent 45 minutes teaching a 6-year-old boy to climb a tree using only her hands and her attention and her eyes. The charity gala for the Westbrook Academy Foundation was held at the Meridian Center on a Wednesday evening in late October. Ava attended every year. She co-chaired the event, which meant she had spent the previous 6 weeks dealing with caterers and auction coordinators and a seating arrangement that went through 11 revisions because 3 board members refused to be seated within eye line of each other for reasons that were never fully explained. She was tired by the time the night arrived in the particular way of someone who has been managing logistics and other people's emotions simultaneously for weeks and has not adequately managed their own. She'd arranged for Sophie to stay with her aunt, her younger sister Dana, who was the only person outside of Cole and Mason and Dr. Okafor that Sophie had shown any consistent ease around. Dana lived 20 minutes away and had a dog named Brisket, who Sophie had taken to with an intensity that suggested she found the dog significantly more trustworthy than most of the humans in her life, which Ava considered entirely reasonable. The event was scheduled from 7 to 10. Ava planned to be home by 10:30. She had not planned for Cole to be there. She saw him across the room about 40 minutes in, standing near the back of the hall again. Apparently this was his preferred position, back corner, clear sightlines, with a glass of something that was probably water and the particular expression of someone who had agreed to attend something they had some reservations about. He was in the suit again. Window-sticking truck, borrowed suit. She was starting to understand that these were not the conditions of his life, but the occasional concessions he made to other people's contexts. She crossed the room without deciding to. "You're here," she said. "Mason's class is performing something in the first 30 minutes, he said. He described it as a musical presentation. "I have low expectations and high hopes." "That's the right approach." He looked at her. "You look exhausted." "Thank you," she said. "That's an excellent thing to say to a woman at her own fundraiser. You have co-chair written all over you." "I've been co-chairing this event for 3 years, and I'm not sure I've ever actually enjoyed it." "Why do you keep doing it?" "Because it matters, and because showing up matters, even when—" She stopped. "You know this argument. You made this argument. You showed up tonight." "I showed up for Mason. And I show up for the kids this foundation serves." She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and took a sip. "It's the same argument with different nouns." Something shifted in his expression, something that might have been, in a different man, admiration, but on Cole it just looked like recalibration, like he was adding new data to an ongoing assessment and updating his conclusions accordingly. "Fair," he said. Mason performed 17 minutes later with 11 other first graders in what the program described as a rhythmic movement piece, and what actually resembled a controlled experiment in how many children could be persuaded to move in the same direction at the same time, the answer being approximately 60% of them on any given count. Mason was in the front row and performed with the complete commitment of someone who had no awareness that there was anything to be self-conscious about, which made him, accidentally, the best one up there. Cole watched the entire thing with his arms crossed and his weight shifted slightly forward, the posture of someone paying close attention. When it ended and Mason came running off the side stage and straight to his father, Cole caught him by the shoulder and said, "You were great." "I know," Mason said immediately. "I was very on beat." "You were somewhat on beat." "I was mostly on beat." "That's closer." Mason grinned the gap-toothed grin and said, "Can I get dessert now?" And Cole said yes, and they moved toward the dessert table, and Ava watched them go and thought about how Mason had never once, in all the time she'd observed them together, sought his father's approval. He simply assumed it was there, the way children assumed the ground would be there when they stepped. That assumption, that bedrock certainty, was either the product of very good parenting or very good luck, and Ava suspected it was primarily the former. She was speaking with the Foundation's legal director near the far side of the room at 9:40 when the lights went out. Not a flicker. Not a brief outage with immediate recovery. They went out completely, every overhead light in the Meridian Center, simultaneously, dropping the room into a darkness broken only by the faint ambient glow of exit signs and the bluish light of the city coming through the high windows. 300 people went from conversation to confusion in under 2 seconds. The sound changed first, the social hum of the room fracturing into a dozen overlapping reactions, voices going up in pitch and volume, the particular collective noise of people reaching for their phones, chairs scraping, someone near the back dropping a glass that shattered. Ava's first thought was Sophie, automatic and total. Then she remembered. Dana's apartment, brisket, safe. Her second thought was the room. She'd been at enough public events in her position to know that crowd confusion was its own kind of hazard, not because the individuals were dangerous, but because 300 people in darkness, each making independent decisions about how to respond, was a system that could tip badly in under a minute. She pulled out her phone, activated the flashlight, and turned to her legal director. "Stay here," she said. "I'm going to find building staff." She was 3 steps into the dark when someone took hold of her arm. Not grabbed, not roughly. A firm, brief contact at the elbow. The kind that communicated stop without force. The kind that assumed the person it was directing was capable of understanding restraint without needing to be restrained. Cole. She couldn't see his face clearly in the dark, but she knew from the height and the quality of the grip and the simple fact that it communicated more in half a second than most people communicated in full sentences. "Don't move yet," he said quietly. Into her ear, close enough that she could hear him under the rising noise of the room. "Give it 10 seconds. I need to find 10 seconds." His grip on her elbow didn't increase. It was just there, steady, certain, asking her to hold. She held. Later she would try to explain to herself what those 10 seconds felt like, and come up with nothing adequate. The room was loud and dark and disordered. Around her, 300 people were making noise and light and decisions, and Cole Walker was standing approximately 8 inches behind her right shoulder, completely still, and she understood without being told that he was not holding still because he was unsure of what to do next. He was holding still because he was reading the room. "Left side," he said. "Service corridor. 2 people moving against the exit flow." She couldn't see what he was seeing. The room was dark and chaotic, and everyone was moving. He had no idea how he had identified 2 specific people in the crowd. How the way they're moving is different. Everyone else is turning toward exits or reaching for phones. These 2 are moving parallel to the wall, heading toward a pause. Short. The stage access, where the kids came out. Ava's blood went cold. "Mason. I see him. He's at the dessert table. He's fine. Don't move yet. You'll intersect their path." His voice was entirely level, not calm in the theatrical sense, not performed composure, just operational. A voice that had been in dark rooms before and had learned that panic was a resource cost with no return. "I need you to go to the main lobby entrance and find building security. Tell them 2 individuals, dark clothing, moving along the west wall toward the stage access corridor. Tell them now. Move fast. Stay in the main crowd flow." "What are you going to do?" "Get Mason and get between them and the stage corridor." She wanted to ask more questions. She recognized this as the wrong impulse and moved instead. She crossed the room in the direction he'd indicated, staying in the main press of people moving toward the lobby, and found the building security chief, a large, exhausted-looking man named Garrett, who was already on his radio, near the main entrance. She told him what Cole had told her to tell him, word for word, and watched his expression shift from general crisis management to specific alert. He said something into his radio she couldn't fully catch and moved. The lights came back on 4 minutes after they'd gone out. The room that greeted the returning light was disorganized and buzzing, but nobody was injured, nobody was screaming, and the crowd, which had been drifting toward general disorder, resolved back into its component individuals with the speed of people who had been briefly frightened and were now mostly relieved and reaching for their phones to document their relief. Ava found Cole near the dessert table. "I was standing with Mason. Mason, who was eating a piece of chocolate cake with the equanimity of someone for whom temporary darkness was a minor inconvenience compared to the continued availability of dessert, and there was a building security guard stationed at the entrance to the stage access corridor, and there were 2 more security staff moving through the back section of the room with the purposeful walk of people responding to a specific directive." "Are you all right?" she asked Cole. "We're fine." He looked at Mason briefly. "You found the cake in the dark." "I used my phone flashlight," Mason said, around a mouthful of chocolate. "It was a strategic decision." Ava looked at Cole. "The 2 people." "Security found them in the corridor. Building is dealing with it." He said it simply. No elaboration, no drama. The tone of someone providing an update on something that was already in the past. "Cole." She stopped, looked at him directly. "What was that? What just happened?" He looked back at her with that steady, settled expression. "Someone cut the power. The 2 people in dark clothing had been in the room since before the blackout. I'd clocked them when I came in. They were positioned wrong for guests. Guests at events like this spread out, find the people they know, orient toward the things they came for. These 2 stayed in the same general position for 40 minutes without talking to anyone and without drinking anything and without looking at the auction tables. You noticed all of that? It's not complicated. It's just paying attention." "It's not just paying attention," Ava said. "Most people do not walk into a charity fundraiser and immediately identify which guests are positioned wrong." Cole didn't argue the point. He just looked at the piece of cake Mason was offering him, apparently a peace offering for the somewhat on-beat situation, and took it without comment. "Were they after Mason?" Ava asked. She tried to keep her voice level, managed it imperfectly. Stage access corridor leads to the back rooms where the performing kids were waiting. Mason's group was supposed to still be back there during the second half of the program. He paused. "Mason came out early for dessert." "Because he had strategic priorities," Mason confirmed. "That's one way to put it." Cole looked at his son for a moment, a look that lasted maybe 2 seconds and contained more than most people communicated in a full conversation. Then he looked back at Ava. "Don't know if Mason was the target specifically. Could have been any child back there. Could have been something else entirely. You think it was connected to Sophie? She said it because she'd been thinking it since the moment he said moving toward the stage corridor, and she was tired of carrying thoughts alone because she thought they might be too heavy for other people. Cole was quiet for a moment. I think someone was at the ballroom 3 weeks ago who shouldn't have been, he said. And I think cutting the power at a school fundraiser where children are present is not random opportunism. The room around them had mostly resettled into its post-adrenaline version of itself. People who'd been frightened and were now performing recovery. Tightened social clusters. Phones held at slightly higher angles than usual. 300 people moving back toward the approximation of a normal evening. Ava looked at the security guard stationed at the stage corridor entrance. I need to know who those 2 people are, she said. Building security has them. I need to know. She looked at him, not out of curiosity. I need to understand if my daughter is in danger. He held her gaze. Then he said, Give me 20 minutes. She gave him 20 minutes. He came back in 17, and the expression on his face when he returned told her before he spoke that the answer was not the one either of them had been hoping for. They're not talking, he said. Gave false IDs to building security. Real cops are on the way, but... He paused. One of them had a photograph. Of what? Cole looked at her steadily. Of Sophie, coming out of Westbrook Academy, dated 4 days ago. The floor seemed to reorganize itself slightly under Ava's feet. She put her hand on the edge of the dessert table without thinking about it. Not for support exactly, but for orientation. Something solid, real. Okay, she said. Her voice came out level. She was aware that this was the shock doing her a professional courtesy. Okay. Mason, Cole said, without looking away from Ava. I need you to go stand with Mrs. Aldridge for a minute. Right there, where I can see you. Mason, apparently reading something in his father's voice that communicated this was not a negotiable request, went without argument, which told Ava something about how rarely Cole used that specific register with his son. I need to call Dana, Ava said. Sophie, call her right now. She already had her phone out. Dana picked up on the second ring, and Sophie was fine. She was on the couch with Brisket watching something on television, and Dana's voice was the easy, slightly distracted voice of someone having a normal evening. And Ava said, Good, stay there, I'll explain later, and hung up before her voice could do something she didn't want it to do. She's okay, she said. Good. Cole was watching her. Not the way people watch someone they were worried was going to fall apart. Not the hovering, ready-to-catch quality that people got when they were anticipating collapse. He was watching her the way he watched everything, steadily and without assumption. You need to tell the police everything you know about the original kidnapping attempt. All of it. Even what you think is old or irrelevant. I know. She pressed her hand against her sternum briefly, a small, self-steadying gesture she wasn't fully aware of making. I know how to do this part. I know you do. She stopped. What? She looked at him. This man who had shown up at a charity fundraiser to watch his son perform a rhythmic movement piece and had somehow, in the margins of that ordinary evening, identified 2 people with a photograph of her daughter and put himself between them in the stage corridor without anyone asking him to, without making it dramatic, without requiring anything from anyone in exchange. Why do you keep doing this? She asked. Doing what? Showing up, inserting yourself. You don't know us. You don't owe us anything. He considered that for a moment. She had the sense that he was not going to offer her a clean answer because clean answers to that question didn't exist, and he seemed like someone who had a low tolerance for pretending otherwise. Mason likes Sophie, he said finally, and He stopped. Started again. I recognize the situation. I've been in situations where someone with a specific set of skills could have made a difference and didn't, for reasons that felt logical at the time. I'm not going to be that person if I can help it. It was not a romantic answer. It was not even particularly warm, in the conventional sense. It was a person describing their value system in the plainest language they had available. Ava looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. The police arrived 11 minutes later. Ava spent the next hour and 40 minutes in a side room off the main hall, answering questions from 2 detectives who were thorough and professional, and whose expressions told her, by the time they were done, that they were taking the photograph seriously. She gave them everything. The ballroom 3 weeks ago. The man in the catering uniform she'd glimpsed at the edge of the surveillance footage that building security had shown her before the detectives arrived. All of it. He sat in the corridor outside the side room with Mason asleep against his shoulder. Mason had crashed somewhere around the 90-minute mark with the total unconscious commitment of a child who had eaten chocolate cake and performed a rhythmic movement piece and found the remainder of the evening insufficiently engaging. And he was there when she came out, looking tired and solid and entirely like a person who had decided to stay and had not required any persuasion to do so. She stood in the corridor and looked at them. The man with the grease-stained Henley under the borrowed suit jacket, and his sleeping son, and the corridor's fluorescent light making everything slightly too bright and unforgiving. "Thank you," she said. "Don't." He shifted Mason's weight slightly. "You don't need to thank me for that." "Cole." She waited until he looked at her. "Someone has been watching my daughter. Someone had a photograph of her taken 4 days ago outside her school. I don't know what that means yet, but I know that tonight you identified them before anyone else did, and you put yourself between them and those children, and you did it without telling anyone what you were doing or why, and—" She stopped, pressed her fingers briefly against her mouth. "I'm not good at this. Accepting help. It feels like admitting something I don't know how to admit." He looked at her steadily. "What does it feel like admitting?" She thought about it honestly. "That I can't protect her alone," she said. "That I've been trying to, and it hasn't been enough, and someone knows that, and they keep coming back because of it." The corridor was quiet. Mason breathed slowly against his father's shoulder. "You've been protecting her for 6 years, Cole said. That's not failure. That's 6 years. He paused. "But you're right that alone isn't working, and now there are people looking at this who can help. Let them." "I'm not good at letting people." "Yeah," he said. "I noticed." She laughed. It came out short and slightly ragged and surprised her entirely. Cole's expression shifted in a way she was beginning to recognize. That small, careful softening around the eyes that was the closest he came to openly smiling, and only appeared when something caught him genuinely off guard. "Go home to Sophie," he said. She went. She drove to Dana's apartment and let herself in with the spare key and found Sophie exactly as Dana had described. On the couch, Brisket pressed against her side, both of them asleep. The television was still on, the volume low, casting blue light across her daughter's face. Ava sat on the edge of the coffee table and looked at Sophie for a long time. Sophie's sketchbook had fallen off the couch cushion and lay open on the floor. Ava picked it up carefully. The drawing on the open page was recent. The pencil lines still sharper than the ones on the pages around it, not yet smudged or settled. It was the park. Again. The maple tree. But this time the figures were different. Mason was in the tree, partway up, and Sophie was at the base looking up at him, and the lines of her figure in the drawing were different from how Sophie drew herself in most sketches. Less drawn in, arms not pulled toward the chest, feet planted a little more firmly on the ground. And in the corner of the page, barely there, drawn small and set slightly apart from the rest, 2 figures on the bench, a woman and a man, sitting with space between them but facing the same direction, watching the tree. Sophie had drawn them as part of the scene, not observers outside it, part of it. Ava set the sketchbook down carefully, face up on the coffee table, and sat in the blue television light, and felt the full weight of the evening settle into her body. The fear and the exhaustion, and the particular grief of loving someone you couldn't completely shield, and underneath all of it, something else, something she was still learning to name. The photograph existed. The threat was real. The police were working and the doors were locked, and Sophie was asleep with Brisket's warm weight against her side, breathing slowly in the blue light. And somewhere on the north side of the city, Cole Walker was putting his son to bed, and whatever the next thing was, whatever the photograph meant, and whoever had taken it, and whatever they intended, it was not, Ava understood for the first time in 6 years, something she was going to face in the particular loneliness of being the only person in the room who was paying full attention. That was not everything. But it was more than she'd had yesterday, and she held on to it carefully, the way you hold things that are real but still fragile, things that have not yet had time to prove how much weight they can bear. The 2 men from the Meridian Center were named Derek Folau and Carl Brennan. It took the police 4 days to establish that, and another 3 to determine that neither name was particularly useful on its own. Both men had records, both had worked intermittently in private security contracting, and both had, in the previous 18 months, been employed at various points by a man named Richard Holt. It took Ava approximately 45 minutes of going through old files she kept in a locked drawer in her home office to understand why that name mattered. Richard Holt had been a silent investor in Sterling Dynamics in its early years, one of 11 people who had put money into the company when it was still running out of a converted loft space in Wicker Park, when Ava was 23 years old and operating on 90-minute sleep cycles, and the particular reckless certainty of someone who has not yet accumulated enough losses to be afraid of them. Holt had invested $400,000. He had expected, in exchange, a board seat and preferential licensing terms on the platform's data infrastructure, terms that Ava had agreed to in a provisional contract, and then, after consulting with a lawyer who pointed out 3 separate ways the arrangement was structured to transfer control of the company's core assets within 5 years, declined to finalize. The fallout had been unpleasant. Holt had threatened litigation. Ava had countered with documentation of the predatory contract structure that she'd quietly assembled with the help of the same lawyer. Holt had gone away, eventually, loudly, bitterly, with the particular fury of someone who is accustomed to winning through intimidation and had encountered an opponent who was both younger and less afraid than expected. That had been 7 years ago. Sophie's kidnapping attempt had happened 8 months later. Ava sat in her home office at 2 in the morning with a glass of water she wasn't drinking and a file folder open on her desk, and looked at the timeline she'd written on a legal pad, and felt the particular nausea of understanding something that had been in front of her for years, and that she had never connected because the police at the time had investigated the kidnapping attempt as a random crime of opportunity, and she had believed them because believing anything else was unbearable. It had not been random. She called Detective Lena Marsh, who was handling the Meridian Center case, and had given Ava her direct number with the specific instruction to use it at 7:15 the next morning. Detective Marsh listened without interrupting, asked 4 precise questions, and said she'd be at Ava's office at 10. The meeting lasted 2 hours. A second detective joined by phone partway through. By the end of it, Ava understood that Holt was now a person of active interest in 2 connected investigations, that Folau and Brennan were cooperating in exchange for reduced charges, and had confirmed Holt's involvement in a general sense without yet providing specifics, and that the working theory, which was still a theory, Detective Marsh was careful to say, still a theory, was that Holt had never entirely abandoned the idea of using Sophie as leverage. Leverage for what? Ava asked. The company is worth 20 times what it was 7 years ago. He can't touch the licensing structure now. He doesn't want the company anymore, Detective Marsh said. She was a compact woman in her early 40s with the kind of direct, unhurried manner that Ava associated with people who had spent a long time delivering bad news and had learned that delivery speed didn't change the content. Based on what Brennan has told us, Holt has been building a case for a civil suit over the original contract dispute. He believes he can argue that the $400,000 constituted a controlling interest that was fraudulently transferred. The suit would be meritless, our legal consultant thinks. But it would take years, Ava said, and cost significantly more than $400,000 to fight, and create the kind of press that depresses stock value and complicates partnerships and generally makes running a company substantially harder. She felt very tired. He wanted leverage. He wanted something to hold over me that would make settling cheaper than fighting. That's the working theory, yes. My daughter, Ava said. She said it plainly, without particular inflection, because she was trying to hear how it sounded out loud. He considered using my 8-year-old daughter as leverage in a business dispute. Detective Marsh looked at her steadily. We don't yet have evidence that Holt directly ordered the original kidnapping attempt. We may not be able to prove that connection, but the pattern of surveillance on Sophie, the photograph, Folau, and Brennan's employment history, it's consistent. Ava nodded. She folded the legal pad closed. What do I do? Continue normal routines as much as possible. Let us work. We have eyes on Holt, and Marsh paused briefly. The man who identified Folau and Brennan at the Meridian Center, Cole Walker. Our sergeant looked up the surveillance footage. He'd like to speak with him. I'll pass that along, Ava said. Oh, she told Cole that evening. They were in the parking lot of Westbrook Academy after pickup, the 2 of them standing between their respective cars, while Mason taught Sophie a new version of the handshake that now apparently involved a sound effect, the specific nature of which he was debating with considerable energy. Cole listened to everything without interrupting. He had a way of listening that felt like more than the absence of talking. It was the quality of someone who understood that listening was its own form of action, that it required something from you. When she finished, he said, "Holt. You know him?" "No, but I know the type." He looked past her at the kids for a moment. "Ex-military, I spent time with men who, when they felt they'd been denied something they were owed, they didn't let it go. They found a way to reopen it, usually sideways, usually through the thing you cared about most rather than the thing they actually wanted. Because they know you'll pay more to protect the thing you love than to win the thing you're fighting about." "Yeah." He said it without satisfaction, just acknowledgement. "The detective wants to speak with you." I figured she would. He didn't seem troubled by it. "I'll call her." "Cole." She stopped. He looked at her. "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me the same way." "Okay. How much danger is she in right now? Not the legal answer, not the detective's answer. Your read." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him actually think about it, not deflect toward reassurance, not reach for the version of the answer that would be easiest to give. Actually think. "Holt knows we're on to Folau and Brennan," he said, "which means he knows the direct approach is compromised. Smart play for him right now is to go quiet, pull back, let his lawyers work, wait for the pressure to dissipate." He paused. "If he's smart. And if he's not? Then he does something reactive, accelerates, tries to force the leverage situation before the investigation closes in." He looked at her. "I don't know which one he is. I don't have enough on him. Best case and worst case. Best case, the investigation moves fast, he lawyers up and goes silent. Sophie never knows any of this was happening. Worst case," he stopped. "Worst case, he decides that what he started 7 years ago is worth finishing before he loses the ability to." Ava absorbed that. "So we're in the window." "Yeah, we're in the window." She looked over at Sophie, who had successfully performed the new handshake, including the sound effect, and was now watching Mason attempt to replicate it, her expression carrying that almost smile that Ava had learned to read as the closest Sophie got to open delight. Her daughter was standing in a school parking lot in the afternoon light with crayon marks still visible on her left hand from the afternoon activity period, watching a 6-year-old argue with himself about timing. "I'm not going to let her feel this," Ava said. "Whatever is happening, she's not going to carry it. She won't if we do it right." Cole was looking at Sophie, too. "Keep her routines. Don't change the texture of her days. If you pull back, restrict, tighten the perimeter too much, she'll feel the change in the air and she'll know something's wrong. Her nervous system is already calibrated for threat detection. Any shift in your behavior reads as confirmation that there's something to detect. So I act normal." "You act like someone who is handling it." He glanced at her briefly. "Which you are." She wanted to argue with that. She was handling it in the technical sense, making calls, providing information, taking logical steps. She was not handling it in the deeper sense, the sense that involved sleeping and eating at reasonable intervals and not sitting in her home office at 2 in the morning with a legal pad and a timeline that rewrote the story of the worst night of her life. She didn't argue. "Okay," she said. "What?" Detective Marsh moved faster than Ava had allowed herself to hope. Within 2 weeks, Folau had provided enough specifics to justify a warrant for Holt's financial records. Those records revealed payments to a third-party security firm that had, in turn, contracted Folau and Brennan for what was documented as executive protection consulting, but which Marsh's team connected through a sequence of intermediary transactions to surveillance activity on Sophie's school and residence going back 14 months. The 14 months landed on Ava like something physical. 14 months. Sophie had been watched, cataloged, photographed for 14 months, and Ava had walked her to school and picked her up and taken her to Dr. Okafor's office, and to Maplewood Park, and to Dana's apartment, and had felt the ordinary parental vigilance of a mother who was careful, who was paying attention, who had not let her guard down. She had not seen it. She sat with that for a long time. She didn't share it with anyone for 4 days. Not Cole, not Dana, not Dr. Okafor. She carried it in the particular way that certain failures demand to be carried, alone first, before they can be put down. On the 4th day, she called Dr. Okafor. I missed it, she said. For 14 months, someone was watching my daughter, and I didn't see it. Dr. Okafor was quiet for a moment. What would seeing it have looked like? I don't know. Something. A face in the wrong place too many times. A car. Anything. Professional surveillance is designed to be invisible, Dr. Okafor said. The people who conduct it are trained specifically to be unseen. A former Navy SEAL with direct experience in threat identification noticed something was wrong at the Meridian Center, and even he needed a specific set of circumstances, the blackout, the misdirected movement, to confirm it. You're measuring yourself against a standard that doesn't exist. She's my daughter. She is, and you've protected her for 8 years. You are not the reason she was in danger. You are not the reason she is safe now. The reason she is safe is a combination of police work and a building security system and a former SEAL who happened to be at a school fundraiser because his son was performing a rhythmic movement piece. A brief pause. Ava, you cannot do this alone. You have never been able to do this alone. That is not a failure. That is what it means to be human. Ava pressed her hand against her face. I hate that answer. I know. It's the right answer. It usually is, unfortunately. Richard Holt was arrested on a Tuesday morning in early December at his home in the northern suburbs. The charges were multiple: conspiracy to commit kidnapping, witness intimidation, criminal surveillance, and the press covered it with the intensity that tended to attach to stories involving billionaires and crimes against children, which meant Ava's phone began ringing at 8:15 and did not meaningfully stop for 3 days. She did not speak publicly. Her communications director handled the statements. Ava's energy went to Sophie and to keeping the texture of Sophie's days as close to normal as she could manage. Sophie knew something had happened. She always knew, but she didn't ask, and Ava didn't explain, and they moved through the days of that week in their particular private language of proximity and sketchbooks and shared meals and the specific quality of quiet that they'd built over years, the quiet that had its own grammar. On the Thursday after the arrest, Cole picked Mason up from school, and they went to Maplewood Park. Ava took Sophie. It had become a Saturday thing, but Cole had texted in the morning, "Park today if you're free." Mason has thoughts on the tree, and Ava had shown the message to Sophie, who had put on her coat before Ava finished reading it. The maple tree was bare now. November had stripped it completely, and the branches stood against a flat gray sky like something drawn in charcoal, angular and without apology. Mason, undeterred, was attempting to establish whether the upper branches were more accessible without leaves blocking the route. Cole watched from the bench with his paper coffee cup and the expression of someone who had done the structural math and was prepared to intervene at a specific altitude threshold. Sophie sat beside Cole on the bench, not at the far end. Beside him. Close enough that her shoulder was almost but not quite touching his arm, which was the closest she got to people she wasn't ready to fully close the distance with yet. Ava sat on Cole's other side and wrapped both hands around her own coffee cup and looked at the bare tree and the gray sky. "It's over," she said. "The police thing. He was arrested Tuesday." "I heard," Cole said. "Of course you did." She told him actually by text. She'd forgotten for a moment. "I keep starting conversations I've already had. You're running on less sleep than you need and more coffee than is advisable. That's been true for 8 years. Yeah, but now you have a specific reason to feel it." Sophie had opened her sketchbook. She was drawing the tree, the bare winter version of it, with the focused attention she gave everything she drew, the slight lean forward, the pressure of the pencil varying with her breath. Ava watched her daughter's hand move across the page. "She doesn't know the details," Ava said quietly. "About why it happened. The business history. I'm not going to tell her. No reason to. But she needs to understand at some point that it's finished, that whoever was watching, whatever the threat was, it's done. The police handled it." She paused. "I don't know how to tell her that in a way she'll actually believe. She's heard things were safe before." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You don't tell her, you show her." "How?" "Same way you've been doing it. Same routines, same park, same school, same people. You let time pile up on top of it. More days when nothing bad happens than days when something did. Her nervous system is keeping count. It always has been." He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "She knows something changed this week. She'd have to be a different person not to feel it. But she also knows... He stopped, looked at Sophie. She also knows that we're here, that we came to the park, that Mason is being ridiculous in that tree. That's not nothing. Sophie had added Mason to the drawing. He was in the bear tree, about halfway up, rendered with specific accuracy. The gap-toothed grin visible even in the small-scale sketch. The coat with the hood half up, because Mason ran warm and had opinions about this. Then she drew Cole on the bench, his posture captured with the same uncomfortable accuracy she always brought to it. Weight settled, arms loose, the quality of someone fully occupying where they were. Then she drew Ava beside him, and then, slowly, with care, with the pencil pressure she used for things that mattered, she drew herself. Sitting between them on the bench, shoulder close to Cole's arm, feet flat on the ground. She looked at the drawing for a moment. Then she turned the sketchbook around and held it toward Cole. He looked at it. He didn't speak for a beat. The expression on his face was the one Ava had seen only a few times, that particular softening that lived behind the steadiness, the thing that existed when something caught him entirely without defense. He took the sketchbook from her carefully, looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then he turned it back toward her and pointed at the figure of himself on the bench. "You got my posture right," he said, "but my coffee cup is bigger than that." Sophie looked at the drawing, then at him. Then she picked up her pencil and made the coffee cup bigger. Cole looked at the revised drawing with great seriousness. "Much more accurate," he said. And Sophie, 8 years old, 6 years and 11 months of silence, sitting on a park bench in December under a bare maple tree, made a sound that was unmistakably, completely, a laugh. Not a breath, not an almost, a real short, unguarded laugh, surprised out of her by a man who had responded to the most careful, deliberate drawing of herself she had ever shown anyone by requesting a larger coffee cup. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then it was over and she looked slightly startled by herself, the way people looked when their body did something before their mind had cleared the action. Cole handed the sketchbook back. "Thank you for the edit," he said, as if nothing had happened, as if they were simply continuing a normal exchange, as if 2 seconds of unguarded laughter from a child who had been silent for nearly 7 years were a thing that could be received without fanfare, without making it a moment too heavy to hold. Ava was looking at the branches of the bare maple tree. She was looking at them very hard. December moved through them the way December does in Chicago. Cold that arrived with serious intentions, and a sky that couldn't decide between gray and white and mostly chose both. Mason started lobbying for a Christmas visit to the Walker Automotive Shop on the grounds that Cole had a space heater in the corner of the garage and allowed the radio on Saturdays, which he had begun describing as the good office. Sophie had, through the medium of a drawing of Mason's gap-toothed face over a wrench, communicated something that Ava interpreted as interest. Cole had texted, "Mason wants to know if Sophie wants to see an engine. I have no explanation for this, but the offer stands." They came on a Saturday in mid-December. The shop was small and smelled of oil and cold metal and the particular warmth of a space heater working hard. Cole had Mason's drawings taped to the wall above the workbench, crayon drawings from ages 3 through 6, a progression that told the story of a child's developing fine motor skills, an increasingly ambitious subject matter, culminating in a recent piece that appeared to depict the truck as a rocket ship, which had been labeled in large letters, "Dad's Rocket." Sophie stood in front of that drawing for a long time. "He did that last month," Cole said, from somewhere behind a hood he was leaning into. "I've chosen to interpret it charitably." Mason, on his shop stool with his sandwich, said, "The rocket version is more accurate to the truck's potential." "The truck's actual top speed is 68 miles per hour downhill," Cole said. "That's pretty fast for a rocket in a school zone," Mason said. Sophie turned from the drawing and looked at Cole, at the visible portion of him, which was mostly his shoulders and the back of his head. Then she walked to the second shop stool, the one next to Mason's, climbed up, and sat. Ava leaned against the far wall with her coffee and watched her daughter sit in a mechanic's shop on a Saturday in December, eating half of the sandwich Mason had immediately offered her, looking at the inside of an engine hood with the evaluative attention she gave everything. Cole walked her through what he was working on. He talked to Sophie the way he always talked to her. Not simplified, not over-explained, not with the slight self-consciousness of adults who weren't sure whether a silent child was understanding them. He described the engine components, and what they did, and what had broken and why. And he held things up so she could see them, and he pointed and explained with the patience of someone who found the explanation worth giving regardless of whether it was asked for. At one point, he handed her a small component, a valve cover, nothing heavy or sharp, and let her hold it while he explained what it sealed. Sophie turned it over in her hands, examining it from every angle, the same way she examined everything she was genuinely interested in. "You can ask me anything," Coley said, not prompting, just leaving the door open, the way he always did, without making the open door the point. Sophie looked at the component in her hands, then she looked up at him, and she said quietly but completely clearly, "How do you know when it's broken?" The shop went very still. It was not a big voice. It was not particularly dramatic. It was the voice of a child asking a real question because they actually wanted to know the answer. It was the voice of someone who had decided that this moment, this question, this person was worth the risk of being heard. Cole didn't react with visible surprise. He didn't make a sound that indicated that anything extraordinary had occurred. He looked at the component she was holding and said, "Usually it leaks. You look for the stain on the housing, the buildup around the seam. Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes you have to clean everything off first and watch for where the new leak starts." Sophie looked at the component. "And then you fix it?" "And then you fix it." She turned the valve cover over once more. Then she handed it back to him. Ava had her coffee cup pressed against her mouth with both hands. She was looking at the drawings on the wall. The rocket truck. The gap-toothed face over a crayon wrench. She was not going to cry in a mechanic's shop on a Saturday. She had made this decision. She came very close to not keeping it. Mason, who had finished his sandwich and was now apparently unaware that anything had happened, said, "Sophie, do you want to see the thing Dad did with the spark plugs? It makes a cool sound." Sophie looked at him. "You have to stand back a little bit," Mason said. "Safety first. That's what Dad always says." "Because Mason once stood not far enough back," Cole said, from under the hood. "I learned something valuable that day," Mason said. Sophie climbed down from the shop stool and stood next to Mason at the appropriate distance, and Cole did the thing with the spark plugs, and it did make a sound, and Mason looked deeply satisfied with himself for having facilitated this experience. And Sophie watched the whole thing with her feet planted firmly on the concrete floor and her arms not drawn toward her chest, just standing, just there, just present in the space without managing it. Ava filed that away. The stance, the flat-footed standing, the arms. She filed it away as evidence. January brought a cold that was serious even by Chicago standards, and with it, a change in Sophie's sessions with Dr. Okafor that Ava only understood gradually. Sophie had started talking. Not fluently, not continuously, not in the way she'd talked before, the easy, unself-conscious chatter of a child who hadn't yet learned that speech was something that could be turned against you. But in the sessions with Dr. Okafor, she had begun, over the course of January, to produce sentences. Short ones. Answers to direct questions. Occasionally a comment that was self-generated rather than responsive. Dr. Okafor described it in their weekly call as the wall developing windows. Not coming down. Not yet, maybe not ever entirely. But openings. Places where light could pass through in both directions. "What changed?" Ava asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it organized into language. "Multiple things, over time," Dr. Okafor said. The resolution of the immediate threat. Her nervous system registered that change even without being told the specifics. The consistent presence of Mason and his father, which represents something her psyche had stopped believing existed. Reliable people who do not make demands and do not leave. A pause. "And you, Ava? You learning to let people in. She watches you. She always has. When you started showing her that asking for help didn't break you, she started believing that maybe it wouldn't break her either." Ava sat with that for a moment. "You're saying I was part of the problem. I'm saying you were part of the solution once you stopped trying to solve it alone." She wanted to argue. She didn't. The thing that changed in February was so quiet that Ava almost missed it. She was making coffee on a Sunday morning, and Sophie came downstairs in her pajamas, and instead of taking her sketchbook to the kitchen table, she stopped beside Ava at the counter. She stood there for a moment, then she said, "Can I help?" Not with gestures. Not with the point and mime that had been her primary language for nearly 7 years. Words. A full, complete four-word sentence delivered with the casual plainness of someone asking something ordinary. Ava handed her the coffee filters without comment. Sophie put one in the machine. Ava scooped the grounds. Sophie pressed the button. They stood together at the counter while the coffee brewed, and neither of them said anything, and it was the most normal moment Ava had experienced in longer than she could measure. When the coffee was ready, Sophie poured a mug for Ava and put in the right amount of cream. She knew, she'd watched 1,000 times, and set it on the counter. Then she went to the kitchen table and opened her sketchbook. Ava picked up the coffee, drank it standing at the counter. She let it be ordinary. She let it be small. She did not allow herself to turn it into a landmark until later, until Sophie was upstairs and she was alone. And then she sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands, and allowed herself, finally, to feel the full accumulated weight of 7 years lifting by fractions too small to see, but real enough to feel. The sketchbook was still open on the table. She looked at the drawing Sophie had been working on. It was the shop. The Walker Automotive Shop, from memory. The workbench and the stool and the heater in the corner. Mason was on his stool. Cole was at the workbench. And Sophie had drawn herself standing in the middle of the shop floor, equidistant from both of them, with a component in her hands, the valve cover. Ava recognized it, and her arms were extended outward, holding it up toward the light coming through the high shop windows. Not clutched to her chest, not drawn in, extended outward, offering the thing she was holding to the light, to see it better, to understand what it was and whether it could be fixed. Ava looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she closed the sketchbook carefully, the way you close something you intended to come back to, and went to refill her coffee. Cole came for dinner for the first time in late February, on a Thursday, because Mason had somewhere in the previous weeks adopted the position that dinner at Sophie's house was a thing that should happen, and had lobbied for it with the particular persistence of a 6-year-old who had identified what he wanted and saw no compelling reason not to ask for it directly until it occurred. Cole had texted, "I've been informed I should ask if Thursday works. I'm choosing to believe this is Mason's idea independently." Ava had texted back, "It is absolutely Mason's idea. Thursday works. I'll cook." She made pasta because it was the thing she could make reliably without it becoming a project, and Mason arrived with a small bunch of flowers he had apparently selected himself at the grocery store, which were slightly wilted and included 2 colors that didn't go together at all and were the best flowers Ava had ever received. Cole arrived with a bottle of wine and the expression of a person doing something slightly outside their usual parameters, and not being particularly bothered by this. The dinner was loud and imperfect and involved Mason tipping his water glass partway over and catching it without spilling more than a small amount, and Cole's pasta slipping off his fork twice before he stabilized his approach, and Sophie going into the kitchen at one point and returning with the pepper grinder because she'd apparently determined Ava had forgotten to put it on the table, which she had. They ate together in Ava's kitchen under the light that made everything look warmer than it was, and Mason talked about the birdhouse project his class was doing, and Cole asked questions about the structural approach to birdhouse construction that were more serious than the situation required, and Sophie listened to all of it with the new quality she'd been developing, not just present, but participating in the presence, letting her attention be visible. After dinner, Cole and Ava did the dishes, while Mason and Sophie went to the living room, and Ava could hear Mason explaining his theory about which birds were most likely to appreciate his specific birdhouse design, a theory that appeared to have significant gaps in its ornithological foundation, but was delivered with complete conviction. "He has very strong feelings about birds suddenly," Ava said. "It started 2 weeks ago. I don't know what triggered it." Cole handed her a washed bowl. "He's been researching. He asked me to take him to the library." "The library?" "I know. I'm choosing to support it." "That's the right call." They worked in companionable quiet for a moment. The dishes were not a complex project, and they'd fallen into a rhythm without discussing it, the way people fall into rhythms when they've spent enough time in proximity. "She said 4 words this morning," Ava said. Not apropos of anything, just because it was in her, and this was apparently a person she'd started saying things to before she'd decided to say them. Just asking if she could help with the coffee. 4 regular words, casual. Cole was quiet for a moment. "How'd that feel?" "Like I'd been holding my breath for 7 years, and someone finally said it was okay to exhale." She looked at the window above the sink, which showed the dark street outside and their own dim reflections. "And also terrifying, Because now I can see what might be lost again, in a way I couldn't let myself see when I was trying not to think about it. Yeah, he said. Does that make sense? Yeah, it does. He set the last pan on the drying rack. The better things get, the more there is to protect. Exactly. She turned to look at him. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, in the particular posture she'd learned to read as Cole Walker at rest, which looked like other people at mild attention. I don't know how to thank you. I've told you. I know what you've told me. I'm telling you anyway. She held his gaze. You didn't have to do any of this. The park, the shop, the school, the Meridian Center. None of it. You could have kept your life contained, kept the boundaries clean. I didn't think of it that way, he said. I know you didn't. That's the thing. She turned back to the sink and dried her hands on the dish towel. You didn't think of it as doing something. You just did it because it needed doing and you were there. She set the towel down. I've spent a lot of my life in rooms full of people who did things because of what they got in return. You don't operate that way. Nobody gets anything worth having by operating that way, he said. A lot of people would disagree with you. A lot of people are wrong. From the living room, Mason's voice rose in pitch as he apparently reached a crucial point in his birdhouse-bird compatibility theory, and Sophie's voice, quieter, lower, but there, real, present, said something in response that they couldn't fully hear. Both of them went still for a moment, listening to Sophie's voice the way you listen to rain after a drought, not making a thing of it, just receiving it. She's going to be okay, Cole said. He said it the same way he said things that were grounded in evidence rather than hope, not as reassurance, but as assessment. I think so, Ava said. You think so? She looked at him sideways. I'm learning to hold the good things without immediately calculating how they could be taken away. He considered that. How's that going? Badly, she said, but I'm working on it. Cole's expression did the thing, the small, careful, almost not there softening, and he looked toward the living room doorway, from which Mason's voice had dropped into the lower register of serious ornithological discourse. For what it's worth, he said, from where I'm standing, she's already there. Ava followed his gaze. Sophie had taken her sketchbook out. She was drawing, and Mason was watching, and she was showing him things on the page as she drew them, pointing and looking up at him and responding to his reactions with small adjustments, including him in the drawing's creation in a way she had never included anyone. Her voice when it came was quiet and imprecise and absolutely real. This one, Sophie said, pointing at something on the page. This bird would like your house. Mason leaned in very seriously. How do you know? A pause, then, it has a good face. Mason accepted this as a completely reasonable criterion for ornithological compatibility. And Ava stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for so long she'd stopped noticing the weight of it. It settled the way things settle when they've been in the wrong place for years and finally find the right one. Not with drama, not with announcement, but with the quiet, absolute certainty of something coming to rest. Spring came to Chicago the way it always did. Reluctantly, then all at once. March went out cold and gray, and then April arrived with the specific violence of a Midwestern spring, all wind and sudden green and the smell of wet soil coming up through sidewalk cracks, and the maple trees in Maplewood Park put out their leaves again in the particular shade of new green that only existed for about 10 days before it deepened into the settled color of full summer. Ava noticed this because she was at the park almost every Saturday now, and because Sophie had drawn the new leaves 3 separate times in 3 different lights, trying to get the color right with whatever combination of colored pencils was available to her, never quite satisfied with the result. The Richard Holt case moved through its legal phases with the grinding, impersonal momentum of the criminal justice system. His lawyers were expensive and creative and managed to complicate the timeline considerably, which Detective Marsh had warned Ava would happen, and which Ava had prepared herself for in the rational part of her mind, while discovering that rational preparation and emotional preparation were 2 entirely different things. There were hearings she was not required to attend, but attended anyway, sitting in the back of the courtroom in a gray coat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the procedural machinery of justice process the man who had looked at her daughter and seen a tool. Holt was 61 years old and looked it in the courtroom in a way he apparently hadn't managed to look it in the business world. His lawyers spoke for him with precision and at length. He himself said very little during the hearings, which the press interpreted as strategy, and which Ava interpreted as the posture of a man who had spent his life paying other people to do the things he didn't want to put his own name on. In April, he accepted a plea agreement. The charges reduced from the full criminal conspiracy count to a set of lesser-included offenses that Ava's attorney explained to her carefully and that she understood in the legal sense while finding them insufficient in the human sense, which her attorney also acknowledged while explaining that the alternative was a trial that could take 2 years and would put Sophie's name and history in front of every media outlet in the city. She accepted the agreement. She sat in her car in the parking garage beneath the courthouse for 20 minutes afterward, not going anywhere, just sitting with the engine off and her hands in her lap. It was done. Not the way she would have chosen, not entirely, but done in the way that real things end. Not with a clean line, but with a settlement, a compromise, a resolution that left marks on both sides. Her phone buzzed. Cole. How'd it go? Not a question mark. He'd learned to phrase things to her as statements rather than questions when the content was something she might not want to be asked about directly. It left room for her to answer or not. She typed, plea deal. He's done. A pause. Then, it's not enough, but it's over. A pause on his end. Then, you okay? She looked at the concrete wall of the parking garage. Getting there, she typed. Going home to Sophie. Good, he sent back. And then, a few seconds later, Mason wants to know if Saturday is still happening. He has a birdhouse update. She found herself laughing in an empty parking garage. It came out tired and real and slightly ragged. Saturday is still happening, she typed. Tell him Sophie will want to see the structural drawings. He doesn't have structural drawings. He should have structural drawings. A pause. Then, he's now making structural drawings. She started the car and drove home. Sophie had a therapist appointment that afternoon, and Ava sat in the waiting area outside Dr. Okafor's office, the way she'd sat there for 3 years. The same chair, the same worn patch on the armrest, where she'd rested her elbow through 100 waiting hours, and turned a paper coffee cup in her hands and listened to the particular quality of quiet that therapist office waiting rooms had. Dr. Okafor came out at 4:58, 2 minutes early, and sat in the chair beside Ava instead of standing in the doorway. That was new. I want to talk to you before Sophie comes out, she said. Ava straightened. Is something... Nothing's wrong. Dr. Okafor held up a hand briefly. I want to tell you something good, and I want to tell it to you before Sophie does, so you have a moment to receive it properly rather than in front of her. Ava held very still. Okay. Today, Sophie asked me something she's never asked before in 3 years of sessions. Dr. Okafor's voice was level and professional, but underneath it was the quality of someone managing their own feeling carefully, the way doctors and therapists did when they'd been in the work long enough for it to reach them. She asked me what I thought had changed. Her words exactly were, why is it easier now? Ava said nothing. I asked her what she thought, Dr. Okafor continued. She thought about it for a while, and then she said, and I'm going to be precise about this because the phrasing matters. She said, because nobody left. The waiting room was very quiet. Nobody left, Ava repeated. That's what she said. Not that the danger was gone. She knows something happened. She's aware the texture of the world has changed, even without the specific facts. Not that she was better, or fixed, or healed. Just that the people who came were still there. Dr. Okafor looked at her steadily. She was counting, Ava. All this time she was counting. Every Saturday at the park. Every Tuesday and Thursday at the activity table. Every dinner, every shop visit, every drawing she showed and got back without anyone making too much of it. She was adding it up. And at some point in the last month or two, the accumulation reached something, a threshold. Ava pressed her fingers against her mouth. She's going to be okay, Dr. Okafor said. Not the same as before, that's not how it works, and you know that. The experience is part of her now, and there's no separating it out. But she has found, I believe, a way to carry it that doesn't require silence. She paused. In 30 years of working with children who have experienced trauma, that is not a guaranteed outcome. It's not even a common one in this time frame. Whatever you built for her this year, Whatever those people around her built, it mattered in a way that most interventions don't. I didn't do anything different, Ava said. Her voice was unsteady. I didn't find a new specialist or a new program. I met a person at a party, and I let him sit at his own table. You let people in, Dr. Okafor said simply. That was the different thing. You let people in, and you kept letting them in, and Sophie watched you do it. Children learn the emotional range that's modeled for them. You'd been showing her for years that the right response to threat was vigilance and management and self-sufficiency. This year you showed her something else. Ava thought about the Sunday morning with the coffee filters, about standing at the counter while Sophie pressed the button on the machine and handed her a mug with the right amount of cream, about how she'd let that be ordinary instead of turning it into evidence of something, and how hard that had been, and how necessary. It wasn't graceful, she said. I didn't handle it well. Half the time I was barely holding it together. Sophie didn't need you to handle it perfectly, Dr. Okafor said. She needed you to handle it, to stay in it, to not disappear into managing the situation from a distance. She stood, straightening her jacket. You did that. The door opened and Sophie came out. She looked at Ava with the direct, clear-eyed attention she'd been developing, not the careful, controlled gaze of the managed survival state, but something more open and less defended. She looked at her mother's face and read something there and came to stand beside her, and without saying anything, she put her hand into Ava's. Ava held it. They walked to the car that way, hand in hand, in the late afternoon light of an April Thursday. The birdhouse went up in early May. This had been a months-long project that began with Mason's structural drawings, which were detailed and ambitious in a way that exceeded his technical knowledge by a significant margin, but demonstrated genuine enthusiasm for load-bearing considerations, and progressed through 2 Saturday afternoons at the Walker Automotive Shop, where Cole, with a level of patience that Ava was fairly certain would have been recognized as exceptional even in genuinely patient people, helped Mason translate his vision into something that could be built with the tools and wood available. Sophie had contributed to the design. This had happened gradually and without announcement. She'd looked at Mason's drawings one Saturday in March and picked up a pencil and added a detail to the roof angle, then looked at Cole, who had looked at the drawing and said, "That's better, actually." And that had been the beginning of a collaborative process that Mason described as a partnership, and that mostly involved Sophie making quiet, precise suggestions, and Mason enthusiastically incorporating them while explaining them as though they'd been his idea from the start, which Sophie appeared to find entirely acceptable. The birdhouse was hexagonal. This had been Sophie's suggestion, and it had required a significant amount of problem-solving on Cole's part, but the result was a thing of genuine, if slightly imperfect craftsmanship. 6-sided, with a proper overhang on the entry hole and a removable floor panel for cleaning, which Cole had insisted on as a matter of structural integrity, and which Mason had accepted on the grounds that birds deserved good maintenance. It went up in Maplewood Park. This had required a permit, which Ava had handled through the Foundation's community liaison, and the selection of an appropriate tree, which Mason and Sophie had conducted with the seriousness of a site survey, and the actual installation, which Cole did on a Saturday morning with a drill and appropriate hardware, while Mason provided commentary and Sophie handed him things in the correct order without being asked. It was not a grand event. There was no ceremony, no crowd, no acknowledgement beyond the 4 of them, and Dana, who had come because she'd heard about the birdhouse for 3 months and wanted to see it, and Brisket, who had come because Dana rarely went anywhere without him, and who spent the installation investigating the base of the tree with professional thoroughness. When it was done, Cole climbed down from the stepladder and stepped back and looked at it. It was crooked by maybe 4 degrees, not structurally significant, but visible if you were looking for it. He looked at it for a moment. "It's a little crooked," Mason said. "I know. Is that bad?" "Not for the birds." Mason considered this. "Maybe birds like a little crooked." "Maybe they do," Cole said. Sophie was looking up at the birdhouse with the expression she wore when she was taking something in fully, committing it to the internal archive she kept of things worth remembering. She had her sketchbook in her bag and had not taken it out, which Ava had started to understand meant that some moments Sophie wanted to simply be in rather than document. The distinction was new and significant. After a while, Sophie said, "How long until a bird comes?" "Depends on the bird," Cole said. Could be a week, could be a month. Birds are particular about real estate. Mason said that too, Sophie said, about the face of the bird. He has a consistent position on bird personality. Sophie looked up at the birdhouse for another moment. I think a bird with a good face will come soon. Yeah? Cole looked up at it too. What makes you think so? She considered the question seriously. Because it was made carefully, she said. Things made carefully attract the right things. Nobody said anything for a moment. Dana, who was standing to Ava's left, made a very small sound. Cole looked at Sophie for a moment with an expression that Ava had learned to read by now. That rare, undefended thing behind the steadiness. Then he looked back up at the hexagonal birdhouse in the maple tree. I think you're right, he said. The announcement came in June. Ava had been building toward it for months, since February, in some form, since the conversations with Dr. Okafor and the morning with the coffee filters, and the gradual, accumulating understanding that the most important work she could be doing was not the work her foundation was currently doing, but something adjacent to it, something that addressed not just the surface of what had happened to Sophie, but the systemic conditions that made Sophie's silence so hard to break. She restructured an entire division of the Sterling Foundation. The existing model had funded conventional therapeutic interventions, specialists and programs in residential facilities, all of which had value and none of which had reached Sophie. The new model, which she built with the input of Dr. Okafor and 3 other trauma specialists and a veterans advocacy organization based in Evanston, paired families of trauma-affected children with trained community mentors, people who had their own experience of high-stress, high-stakes situations, and who had developed the specific capacity for patient, non-demanding presence that conventional therapeutic relationships sometimes struggled to provide. It was not a program designed to replace therapy. Ava was careful about that, because the last thing children who had been let down by systems needed was another system replacing the previous one with the same blind spots dressed differently. It was designed to fill the gap between clinical intervention and daily life, the space where actual healing happened, in kitchens and parks and mechanic shops and on park benches in December under bare maple trees. She named it the Threshold Program. The press coverage was significant and mostly accurate, which was more than she usually expected from press coverage of anything. Several journalists connected it, in varying degrees of specificity, to Sophie's history, and Ava let them make those connections without confirming or denying the personal dimension, because Sophie's story was Sophie's to tell or not tell, on whatever timeline she chose, and Ava was finished making decisions about her daughter's narrative without her. The public statement she released was 12 sentences long. The sentence people quoted most was this one. The greatest thing my daughter received this year wasn't bought. It came from someone who had survived their own difficult years and chose, without being asked, to show up and stay. Cole read it on his phone in the shop and texted her. You didn't run this by me. She texted back. I didn't name you. You described me. I described the program's philosophy. A long pause. Then, it's a good program. Thank you. Another pause. Then, Sophie know about it? Ava looked across her office to the small couch by the window where Sophie was sitting with Brisket. Dana had started a habit of dropping the dog off on days when Sophie was out of school, and Ava was working from home, which Brisket appeared to consider an acceptable arrangement, drawing in her sketchbook with the radio on low. She helped name it, Ava typed. The 3 dots appeared and disappeared twice before Cole sent, Of course she did. Cole asked Ava to dinner in July. Not a family dinner, not the park or the shop or the school. He texted on a Wednesday evening and said, There's a place on North Clark I've been meaning to try. Saturday, if you're free. Just us. Ava read it twice. Just us was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and they both knew it. She sat with her phone for a moment. The reasonable part of her mind ran through the various complications, the existing dynamic, the children, the fact that whatever they'd built over the past year was functional and good. And she was afraid of what happened to functional good things when you changed them. The less reasonable part of her, which had been paying attention to Cole Walker since a ballroom in October and had been running its own quiet count all this time, recognized that just us was not a change. It was an acknowledgement of something that had been true for a while. She typed, Saturday works. He picked her up at 7 in the truck, which he'd apparently made a specific effort regarding. It was clean, which she gathered was not its default state, and the passenger window had been repaired, which she discovered when she got in, and it rolled down smoothly. "You fixed the window," she said. "It was time," he said. They drove to the restaurant on North Clark, which was small and not particularly fancy, and had a menu that changed based on what the chef felt like making, which Cole had researched in the specific way he researched things. Not extensively, just enough to confirm it was real and worth the trip. They sat at a corner table, which Ava noticed and which Cole either hadn't noticed or had arranged without mentioning it, and she decided not to ask which one. The dinner was not dramatically different from other time they'd spent together. Cole was still Cole, direct, unhurried, better at listening than most people were at talking. Ava was still herself, sharp edges intact, the capacity for complete sentences not entirely suppressed even when she was nervous, which she was, in a way she hadn't been nervous in a very long time. The difference was the absence of children. Without Mason's running commentary filling the space and Sophie's sketchbook providing a point of shared focus, they were simply two people at a table, and the conversation that happened was different, not easier, exactly. More exposed. Cole talked about his years in the military in a way he hadn't before, but not operationally, not the craft of what he'd done, but the weight of it. The specific kind of exhaustion that came from years of operating at a pitch that human beings weren't designed to sustain indefinitely. The decision to leave. The period after that he described simply as not great. Two words that contained, Ava suspected, a great deal of specific material that he'd decided wasn't necessary to put on the table on a first dinner, but that she understood was there. "What made it better?" she asked. He thought about it. "Mason," he said. Then he was quiet for a moment. "Having something that needed me to be present rather than just operational. There's a difference. Operational you can do from behind glass. Present requires you to actually be in the room. Learning to be in the room again." "Yeah." He turned his wine glass slowly. "That took a while." "How long?" "Couple years." He looked at her. "The work with the kids, the recovery work, in the field, that helped too. You have to be present for that or you're useless. It pulled me back." A pause. "I missed it after. Having a reason to use that part of myself. Felt like carrying something with nowhere to set it down." Ava thought about Holt and the parking garage and the 11 minutes in a car 3 blocks away and the 6 years of specialists and Dr. Okafor's voice saying you let people in. She thought about the specific texture of carrying things with nowhere to set them down, which she understood from direct experience. "And then a child ran across a ballroom," she said. He looked at her. "And then a child ran across a ballroom." The corner of his mouth moved. "I thought she was lost." "She wasn't lost." "No," he said. She knew exactly where she was going. They ate their food and drank their wine and talked about things that were not children and not crises. The book he'd been reading, which was a history of mechanical engineering that he described as specific in a way that most people would find unreasonable, and the foundation expansion she was managing, and a documentary about deep-sea biology that Mason had put on a few weeks ago, and that had apparently given both of them unexpected feelings about the nature of deep-sea creatures. "He cried," Cole said. "About the fish?" "About the anglerfish. He felt the anglerfish had an unfair situation. The anglerfish has an objectively unfair situation. That's what I told him. He found it somewhat comforting." She was laughing again. She'd been laughing with this man since October, she realized, in parking lots and mechanic shops and park benches and courthouse parking garages. And it always surprised her, not because she'd forgotten how to laugh, but because she'd forgotten that it could be easy, that it didn't always have to cost something. They walked back to the truck after dinner through a July evening that was warm and smelled like the city in summer. Hot pavement and food, and someone's window unit air conditioning, and, cutting through all of it, the faint green smell of the lake a few blocks east. Chicago in July was its own particular argument for the city's continued existence, and Ava had forgotten, in years of driving everywhere and living in glass towers, what it felt like to walk through it. Cole walked beside her without filling the quiet, because he never filled quiet for the sake of filling it, and she was grateful for that and told him so. "You're thanking me for not talking," he said. "I'm thanking you for knowing when not to." "That's a low bar." "You'd be surprised." At the truck he unlocked her side first because the door was particular about its handle, another quirk she'd learned, and held it while she got in, which was not a production, just a thing he did without commentary. She thought about saying something about it. She didn't. On the drive back, she said, "I want to tell you something." "Okay." "I've spent most of the last year trying not to. Register what this has been. What you are. What you are to Sophie and to me." She looked out the window at the city going past. "I told myself I was being careful, being appropriate, not reading into things." She paused. "I think I was also just afraid." He drove without responding for a moment. She heard him take a breath. "Yeah," he said, "I know the feeling. I'm not afraid of it anymore." She looked at him. "I don't know what to do with it yet, but I'm not afraid of it." Cole was quiet for a moment. The city moved past the windows. He drove the way he did everything, without excess, without performance. "That's enough for now," he said. "That's enough to start with." She turned that over. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a plan or a commitment or a mapped-out territory. It was just two people in a repaired truck acknowledging, plainly, that something real existed and that they were not going to pretend otherwise. For a person who had been pretending otherwise for most of a year, it was substantial. Well, Sophie went back to school in September. Not the way she'd been going, quietly, managed, entering the building in the careful way of someone navigating a space that hadn't fully been established as safe. She went back the way she'd once, before all of it, moved through the world, with her backpack on her shoulder, and her sketchbook in the front pocket, and a specific destination in mind. She'd spent the last week of August in what Dr. Okafor described as a period of intentional preparation, talking through the first day in session, identifying the specific things that might be hard, building the internal language for asking for help when she needed it. Sophie had approached this the way she approached building the birdhouse, methodically, with genuine attention to the structural details, uninterested in pretending the challenge wasn't real. On the morning of the first day, she came downstairs in her school clothes with her backpack already on and ate breakfast with the focused efficiency of someone with a schedule to keep. She had been talking in full sentences for months now, not constantly, not without effort, still with the careful quality of someone for whom words were chosen rather than automatic, but real and present and entirely hers. She ate her cereal and said, "I'm ready." Ava looked at her daughter across the kitchen table. 8 years old when this all began, 9 now, growing in the particular way of children who were doing the work of growing through something rather than around it. Not unchanged, not unmarked, but genuinely forward. "I know," Ava said. Cole had texted the night before. "Good luck tomorrow. Mason says he'll be on the same entrance at the same time, safety in numbers." And then, a few seconds later, his words. I said nothing. Sophie had read the text over Ava's shoulder. She'd developed a habit of appearing silently beside Ava when the phone came out, a habit Ava suspected was part surveillance and part genuine curiosity. And she'd taken the phone from Ava's hand, which was new, and typed back, "Tell Mason I know where the good tree branches are." Then she'd handed the phone back and gone upstairs to lay out her clothes for the morning. Cole had sent back a single laughing face. Then, he is very motivated now. At 8:15 on the first morning of September, Ava parked in the Westbrook Academy lot. Cole's truck was already there, the window rolled down in the morning air, Mason hanging out of it talking at a volume appropriate for someone who had been awake and enthusiastic for several hours already. Sophie got out of the car with her backpack on. Mason jumped out of the truck with his backpack half-zipped and his tie clip-on and already crooked, because some things were consistent, and said, "Okay, so I have been thinking about the tree situation, and I believe there are at least 2 branches that are accessible now that the leaves are—" Sophie looked at him. "Right," Mason said. "School first, tree later." "Tree later," Sophie confirmed. Cole was leaning against the truck with his coffee cup, watching the two of them with the expression that lived behind his steadiness when something caught him unguarded. He looked at Ava over the roof of the truck. She looked back. Neither of them said anything. Some things had moved past the point where language was the right tool for them. Sophie shouldered her backpack more firmly and looked at the school entrance. Looked at Mason. Looked back at Cole, briefly. The particular look she'd developed over the year. The one that was a check-in rather than a question. Confirming presence rather than asking for permission. Cole gave her a small nod. Just that. She turned and walked toward the entrance. Mason fell into step beside her, already describing his theory about the optimal route to the tree via two specific landmarks, a theory that seemed to require both hands to explain fully. They were almost at the door when Sophie turned around. She looked at Cole and Ava standing on opposite sides of the truck, paper coffee cups and morning light between them. "Bye, Dad, Cole," she called. Clear, loud enough to carry, without any of the managed carefulness that had once surrounded every word she spoke. "See you this afternoon." Cole's face did something complete and undefended for about 2 seconds. "See you this afternoon," he said. Sophie smiled at him, real, full, the smile of a child who had found her way back to herself through the long dark of years and found that herself was still there, still intact, changed but not gone, and turned and walked through the school doors. The playground around the entrance was full of parents and children and the particular organized chaos of first day morning, and several people nearby had witnessed the exchange, and several of them were trying not to make it obvious that they were affected by it, with varying success. Ava walked around the front of the truck. Cole was looking at the school doors. He had his coffee cup in both hands and the expression of someone receiving something they'd stopped expecting. She stood beside him, not reaching for anything, not filling the silence with words it didn't need. After a moment he said, "Dad, Cole." "Yeah, I didn't—" He stopped, started again. "I wasn't expecting that." "I know," Ava said. "It's a good name," he said, after a pause. And his voice, which was almost always level, which she had heard stay steady through a power outage and a photograph of her daughter in a stranger's hands and the particular weight of all the things he'd been asked to carry over a lifetime. His voice was not entirely level. It wasn't a lot. It was just the small human evidence of someone being reached by something they had not armored against because they hadn't known it was coming, because the best things usually came that way. Ava had spent 7 years learning the wrong lesson about safety, that it was something you built high enough and strong enough, and if you maintained it without gaps, the important things inside it would be protected. She'd built it out of money and specialists and vigilance, and the particular exhaustion of someone who believed that loving someone correctly meant never putting down the weight of protecting them. What she knew now, what Sophie had taught her, and Cole had taught her, and a park bench in December, and a mechanic shop in December, and a birdhouse 4 degrees crooked in a maple tree had taught her, was that safety wasn't a structure. It wasn't something you built around the people you loved to keep the world out. It was something you built between people, out of presence and consistency and the specific courage of staying. When staying was difficult, and returning when returning was hard, out of dinners that were loud and imperfect, and wine glasses turned slowly on tables and coffee cups in parking garages, and the quiet accumulation of days when nothing bad happened and someone was still there at the end of them. It was built slowly. It was built without guarantees. It required you to let people close enough to matter, which was also close enough to hurt, and there was no version of it that didn't include that risk. And the people who tried to find a version that didn't were the people who ended up alone in glass towers at 2 a.m. with timelines on legal pads, running a protection protocol that protected them from everything, including the things that might have saved them. She'd been saved anyway. By a child who ran across a ballroom and by a man who let her stay. By a 6-year-old with structural drawings and a gap-toothed grin and no awareness that there was anything complicated about any of it. By a dog named Brisket and a park bench and a valve cover held up to shop window light and 4 words spoken quietly on a night when everything was being counted. Nobody left. That was what Sophie had said. That was the thing that had been enough. Not the program, not the money, not the years of professional intervention, just people who came and then stayed, who showed up without being asked and kept showing up, who treated Sophie's silence as a language worth learning rather than a problem worth solving, who had their own damages and their own imperfections and showed up anyway, every Saturday, with crackers and coffee and structural drawings and the absolute ordinariness of people who intended to be there. Ava looked at the school doors where her daughter had just walked. 9 years old, gap-toothed grin contagious as a yawn, drawing birds that had good faces, teaching tree climbing through hand signals, saying this bird would like your house with the complete assurance of someone who had found her way back to trusting her own knowledge of things. 9 years old and already understanding something it had taken Ava 30 years to get close to, that what you made carefully attracted the right things, that the work of making something well, a birdhouse, a life, A family, assembled from whatever material circumstances provided, was its own kind of invitation to what deserved to come. Cole was still looking at the school. Ava reached over and took the coffee cup out of his left hand and drank from it without asking, which was something she had not done 4 months ago and did now without thinking because some thresholds, once crossed, were just the new normal. He looked at her sideways. "That's mine," he said. "Yours is better. It's the same coffee." "Is it, though?" He looked back at the school. "No," he said, after a moment. "I guess not." The morning moved around them. Other parents leaving, cars pulling out, the particular post-drop-off dispersal of adults returning to their separate lives. In the maple tree at Maplewood Park, 3 blocks east, a bird with a good face had taken up residence in a hexagonal birdhouse with a removable floor panel and a 4-degree lean, and had apparently found it acceptable. Mason had confirmed this with photographic evidence the previous Saturday and had been formally vindicated on the question of bird personality assessment. Things made carefully attracted the right things. Sometimes those things were small. A hand on a jacket at a charity ballroom. A crayon pushed gently across a table without comment. A coffee cup made bigger on request. A promise made to a silent child. "I'm not going anywhere." Sometimes small things were the whole story. Sometimes the whole story was enough.